So the humans were spreading through the stars. Faster-than-light engines were actually not that much of a challenge. Well, breaching that barrier for the first time was spectacularly arduous, but now we had mastered the technique. There were numerous stars that we visited. Turns out habitable planets, and even planets with an ecosystem of life, are not exactly rare. We found a great many of them just in our little sidearm of the galaxy, and our exploration vessels are still out and about. There was quite a backlog for the scientists that follow in their wake, and an even longer one for the shipyards that simply could not churn out colony ships rapidly enough. It was a remarkable era of history unfolding for that generation of humans. Venturing outward into the vast expanse of space, the most eager explorers were the nimble and swift vessels of the SETI program. Among all the remarkable forms of life we had encountered thus far, the species inhabiting those vibrant worlds were astonishingly lacking in intelligence. Nearly indistinguishable from plants in their cognitive abilities, a mere housefly would outmaneuver the most complex of them in a game of strategy. There existed no entity capable of communication, or even the faintest glimmer of a communicable thought. Not a single comprehensible intelligence that could respond to our presence in any meaningful manner. 2 days ago, Earth days, naturally, always Earth days, that shifted significantly. We intercepted electromagnetic signals traversing the expanse between a couple of systems. We pinpointed their origin and dispatched every conceivable greeting on our way there. And we not merely received a response, but commenced communicating. Simple beeps and boops initially, of course. The brightest humans were poring over those signals and messages, striving to translate and interpret them, and simultaneously endeavoring to devise a means to render our noises comprehensible. They faltered. Though there is invariably another party in a dialogue, and fortuitously for us they did not falter, so the humans received an invitation. One individual, a vessel without hostile intent, and a designated site beyond our charted domains, where they would anticipate our arrival. As the proposition seemed highly precarious and rather like an entrapment, it actually took a couple of moments before the SETI initiative was inundated with applications from eager volunteers. One individual was swiftly designated as ambassador to quell the frenzy, hastily ushered into a largely automated exploration vessel, and then propelled towards the general direction of our hopefully soon-to-be allies. Adhering to those instructions, guided the exploration vessel to a vacant region of space, the nearest star being light years distant. Initially, nothing else appeared present, but after the ambassador conducted another sensor scan, a second ship was detected. Its signature was minuscule, rendering it nearly imperceptible. She transmitted the prepared greeting and swiftly received a response, an approach vector, and an invitation to board. The ambassador sat on what seemed a stool before a window that divided the room. On the other side, with a much lower floor, stood a member of the sapient alien species. It towered over her, at least 6 times her height. As far as she could discern, it rested on a single appendage, not unlike a snake's tail, but stocky and thick as a tree trunk. The upper body slimmed slightly to what was likely the torso, and then curved sharply into broad shoulders, where it had 2 arms that could probably reach the floor if they weren't posed like a mantis. There were another 2 pairs of shorter and finer appendages hanging from the torso below the shoulders that had very delicate 3-digit manipulators on their ends. Relatively speaking, these hands would have easily been big enough to grasp a human. At the very top was the head hanging on a bent neck, which could have been called snake-like as well, though it was quite different. Too broad and flat, no visible mouth, and 2 pairs of fully black eyes on the sides. There was no way to discern if it was wearing clothes, the flat grey colour entirely featureless, practically the same as the walls surrounding her. Absorbing these particulars, she had already disregarded the object she had retrieved from the seat and inquisitively examined before the wall had unexpectedly turned transparent. It was a palm-sized disc with a completely smooth and unbroken beige surface. The material felt warm when touched, though its substantial weight led her to believe it was fashioned from metal. "Salutations," an impassive voice chimed from the unfamiliar device that evidently served as a translator. The voice seemed incongruous with the towering stature of those aliens, resembling more a poorly recorded child's speech, with garbled murmurs playing in the backdrop. Concurrently, the alien behind the glass gradually swiveled its head, fixing its gaze upon her in a manner akin to a stadium spotlight's glare. The customary greeting she was meant to give slipped her mind, and she responded with a tentative, "Hello?" as she appeared to diminish in stature. "Your ship is mathematically incorrect," the device chirped. What? "Your ship is mathematically incorrect." This marked an unusual commencement of interactions, and that translation gadget could potentially prove futile. However, she did manage to regain her composure to initiate afresh and adhere to protocol. "I am Ambassador Neil, dispatched to speak on behalf of all humanity. I bring a message of peace and a desire to forge a bond of amity between our peoples and our worlds, so that we may learn from one another and progress together through the sharing of knowledge, as I was saying. Why is it incorrect, your ship?" She regarded the translator intently. Following a short pause, she uttered, "I'm afraid I don't quite comprehend your inquiry concerning my vessel." "What motivated you to construct it in this manner? I'm referring to the design of your vessel," she inquired, but the alien entity remained motionless. Even if she could interpret its body language, there was no discernible way to determine whether it was inquisitive, irritated, or critical. The emotionless artificial voice did little to aid comprehension, further obscured by the persistent background noise. What kind of inquiry was that? Ambassador Neil did not construct the craft, and she possessed scant knowledge about spacecraft engineering, though that alien vessel was indeed highly exotic in its design from what she had witnessed upon her approach. Flowing curves and rounded fluid shapes dominated its form, which had the silhouette of an elongated disc, with bulbous protrusions on the flat areas. There was no discernible way to determine which end was fore or aft, no breaks in the surface for engine outlets, windows, illumination, or sensors. It appeared more akin to an artistic piece than a spacecraft, and the interior had been no different. The corridor that had led her from the docking area to this chamber was unbroken as well. As she traversed through it, she had taken in the soft, off-white hue of the floor that transitioned fluidly up the curved walls into a dark grey on the ceiling that had a gentle undulating texture. Though it was pleasantly illuminated, there was no visible source of lighting, or anything else besides the bare surfaces. The smaller human exploratory craft appeared rather ungainly when juxtaposed. Was that the sentiment the alien entity sought to convey? The vessel adhered to proven design principles in its construction. It is a practical craft intended for long-range exploratory voyages. Might I inquire as to a name by which I may address you? It raised one of its four lesser limbs to gesture towards her, the movement again carried out in an extremely deliberate manner. Once it had concluded, the translator device activated. This entity. Two entities, they exist, precisely alike. It required a brief instant for her to comprehend what it was likely referring to. Adorning her white all-purpose pressure suit were shoulder ribbons, fashioned in an old-style textile weave, embellished with brightly colored yarn forming several distinct striped patterns, and they were symmetrical in design. Perhaps this offered a light-hearted topic for conversation, so she unfastened them and laid them side by side upon her forearm. These emblems signify my role as an envoy. All individuals in official capacities bear distinct insignia, though these too hold ceremonial significance, their designs tracing back to our ancient heritage. Its gaze remained unwavering, the intensity undiminished. How did you construct it? The emblems, precisely identical. It required a brief pause for her to formulate a response. The process of their creation eludes me. I suspect there exists. How can you not comprehend? The translator uttered in a more elevated tone. Perhaps it merely appeared louder as the entity had inclined noticeably nearer to the transparent barrier. Ambassador Neil fidgeted on the stool. This was not remotely how things were meant to unfold. She had no clue what the alien creature was rambling about. Perhaps it wasn't a representative of their species after all. Maybe this was an interrogation of sorts, or maybe they had simply erred in attempting a face-to-face encounter so soon after the initial communications. This meeting was going poorly and she was flustered, though she hoped she was able to conceal it. At least that was Xyloranthar Ven's hope. First, the human had been even tinier than anticipated, the diminutive being now awkwardly perched on the translator's pedestal. And then Nayar's light-hearted, inquisitive questions seemed to utterly fail in breaking the tension. But it was truly peculiar. The human was strikingly beautiful, yet their ship was decidedly not. It was a pointed wedge that aggressively defied the flow of space and the physical forces within. Naturally, the final revelation had stunned her the most. The human seemed unaware of how the adornments they wore were crafted. Yet, Nayar conceded they were exquisitely constructed, identical down to the minutest detail she could perceive. Perhaps for hive minds, that shared knowledge was accessible, while currently eluding this human. Nayar crafted some pleasant diplomatic phrases in the human tongue and transmitted the thought through the translator. Allow me to reiterate that the insignias are exquisite and skillfully crafted. Kindly forgive my inquisitiveness regarding their creation. I meant no offense. Perhaps you could enlighten me further about your fascinating biology instead. I am eager to comprehend your means of communication through a shared consciousness. How do you establish connections with one another across vast interstellar distances? After that, she anticipated the translator to generate those air vibrations which were the human method of conveying information across short distances. Rather efficient too, as it required barely any energy and simultaneously functioned among large numbers of individuals. Though it was a tad simpler than just transmitting thoughts, and so likely provided less capacity for substance. The translated response was tinged with slight bewilderment, seemingly the normal state for that human, and a brief explanation of quantum entanglement ship-to-ship communication. But that was not the information Nayar sought. She suspected the translator to be imprecise, even though she had initially been quite proud of her creation. Thank you kindly for the explanation regarding your ship-to-ship communication technology. I'm afraid I haven't grasped how it relates to your interhuman communication. Could you please elaborate on how you communicate between humans outside the range of your voices? On this occasion, the sense of bewilderment was so profound that it encompassed all that resurfaced. I apologize for the lack of clarity, and I'll endeavor to explain from my perspective. Since your arrival, I cannot detect any signals of any kind emanating from you or being transmitted to you at present. Based on your role representing all humans and your current state of awareness, you appear to still be connected to the shared consciousness. I merely seek this information to uphold my earlier assurance that no harm will come to you in my presence. My least desire is to inadvertently sever your connection to the collective due to my own ignorance. Further perplexity arose, prompting a courteous request for clarification. Engaging in this roundabout manner of conveying information proved mentally taxing, and this encounter seemed poised to surpass Nayar's lengthiest prior experience. With care, she formulated additional statements, yet her inquisitiveness and mild vexation momentarily gained the upper hand. "What is the nature of your collective consciousness?" she inquired directly, the words escaping before she could reconsider. Fortunately, the human did not seem repulsed by her candor and even appeared to grasp this inquiry more clearly. There was no perplexity associated with the response, and they plainly affirmed that humans were not a collective consciousness, and this particular one was an autonomous individual. But that seemed implausible. How could a creature so minuscule possess a neural system intricate enough to communicate intelligently, let alone devise technology for interstellar travel? What advantage, then, did their vast numbers confer? With a mental command, she activated a full-spectrum communication jamming field in the meeting room, an emergency safeguard she had installed but never anticipated using. Remarkably, she detected no change in the human's state, confirming it was a self-contained entity, independent of any shared consciousness. Nayar was puzzled and inadvertently let another thought slip. The disc emitted a chirping sound. "Inconceivable, your size is insufficient." She sensed a hint of bewildered disbelief in its tone this time. Ambassador Neil rose instinctively, drawing herself up to her full stature. She stood at least 2 hand-widths taller than average. With her oftentimes unruly curly hair, it might have even been 3. With an effort, she regained her diplomatic composure and inquired, "There may be some misunderstandings on both sides. Please, help me comprehend the connection between size and intelligence, and how it relates to your perception of human physiology." For a full 60 seconds, the large, unwavering black eyes simply gazed. Then the translator activated to convey, rendered nearly indecipherable through even more garbled and amplified static. Cerebral capacity immense, cognitive prowess elevated. This proved a vexing experience, with such terse and almost purposeless responses and inquiries. Compounding matters, the translation apparatus appeared to be degrading, if the deteriorating speech quality was any sign. Neil suppressed the impulse to pace around the room, which often aided her thought process, and took a couple of deep breaths before responding. "I apologize, but I'm struggling to comprehend the intent behind our present interaction, and I would recommend, for the sake of preserving amicable relations going forward, that I temporarily return to my vessel and—" "In what manner did you construct your vessel?" the voice inquired again, the distortion having subsided to a minimal level. "I did not build it." "Did you build your coverings?" For a brief moment, she gazed down at the rigid exterior of the suit's chest plate, housing the collapsible helmet and an ample supply of air and power. Her entire form was encased in the segmented, semi-flexible suit, tailored precisely to her measurements. It was undoubtedly her suit, yet she had not crafted it herself. The same could be said of the vessel she had arrived in. It had been adapted to transport solely her. A hazy realization began to take shape in her mind. "None of the equipment I carry was constructed by me," she said after a momentary pause. "But did you build your vessel single-handedly?" What an odd inquiry that was. How else could Nia traverse the vastness of space? Her exasperation was already heightened due to the prior misunderstandings. This situation was utterly perplexing, with the human evidently donning protective garments that conform to their physique, and movements with seemingly optimal precision, yet claiming not to have constructed it. It was patently clear that it did not sprout from a tree. Nia found herself completely bewildered, unable to comprehend how anything functioned with those humans. Compounding this was the fact that her entire body was beginning to ache from standing politely for such an extended duration. "I am indeed the creator of this vessel," she mused briefly, yet even that simple statement felt somewhat amiss, for who else would have crafted her ship? The prompt response arrived tinged with an excitement that left her perplexed. The human now inquired whether she had utilized her hands in its creation. Nia was nearly jolted. She hadn't anticipated the previous query could be surpassed, and yet here came this one. What an entirely illogical inquiry. "Yes," came in the clearest tone yet. Just to be completely certain, she continued, "Are there machines here that construct vessels?" She noticed further stirring from the creature this time. It repositioned itself and then swiveled its head to gaze at her with the other set of eyes, though it was the same piercing stare. "A machine cannot build." Now Neil could not cease her pacing any longer. The alien entity was immense and more massive than any terrestrial creature on Earth. If size truly correlated with intelligence, and it was not merely sentient, but capable of constructing a spacecraft and a fully operational, albeit seemingly restricted, interspecies translator by hand, the latter accomplished a mere 2 days after initial contact with humans, it must possess exceptional intelligence and skill in all manner of crafts. Neil did not comprehend how the vessel she occupied functioned. Someone else did. Well, there likely was no single individual in the world that grasped the intricate workings of all its individual components. Thus, the humans were a form of hive mind in comparison. If this alien race lacked advanced technology, they likely had no computers. The implication was staggering. She found herself with countless questions that transcended mere diplomatic aims. Perhaps the initial step was fostering greater mutual comprehension. The ambassador opened her hand, which had unconsciously clenched around the insignias she had removed earlier. Meticulously, she straightened them and arranged them once more on her forearm. These emblems were crafted through the collaborative efforts of multiple individuals, yet they exhibit an identical appearance, as they were constructed by an automated mechanism. The extraterrestrial being initially retreated slightly, then lowered itself to rest its upper form upon the larger appendages. It inclined its head downward to meet her gaze and drew as near to the transparent barrier as it could. "Tell me. More." "You got them." "That seems likely. Allow me to verify the data's coherence," responded an indistinct semblance of a visage displayed on the screen. Ambassador Neal disconnected the cable that had recently linked the chest component of her versatile pressure suit to the console before her. As she reclined, she instinctively raised her hands and ran her fingers through the textured curls at the back of her head, momentarily indulging in the soothing motion. "All good, I think. What are your instructions?" "Obtain as many personnel from the reserve as feasible and assign them to the primary team. I desire that every available individual thoroughly scrutinize the audio recording and meticulously analyze each utterance it contains." "And the translator?" Her gaze settled on the disc-shaped device that seemed slightly out of place, its smooth, nearly organic exterior, a soft matte beige amidst the shiny metals and polished plastics in every gradient between white and black. The communications room was filled with cutting-edge tech, screens everywhere she looked, computer racks enhancing the ship's mainframe, and several layers of redundant backups for any part of the comm system crammed in there. A narrow path to the door and the floor-mounted swivel chair was actually all the space available for a human. I possess it presently, yet there is no information I can impart regarding it. No discernible energy source, no quantifiable outgoing transmissions, indeed, not even a hint of its operational mechanism. However, I have subjected it to the wavebox analysis, so kindly examine that data. "Okay then, how much time do we have?" 2 hours at most. I might rest for a bit, though I'll likely struggle to unwind. My appetite isn't great either. Simply carry on with your tasks and update me as soon as possible, all right? "I suggest resting nonetheless. See you in a bit." "Farewell," she responded, subsequently terminating the communication by making contact with a specific region of the display. Neal had just a single point of contact, but she envisioned in her mind how behind them were multitudes that would soon labor relentlessly on analyzing whatever information could be gleaned from the recordings and scans she furnished. Wasn't that very act, the delegation of labor and dissemination of experience and knowledge, an actual component of the definition of a hive mind? Dispelling that notion, she endeavored to mentally organize the events of the preceding hour. That initial encounter had concluded with the extraterrestrial requesting a respite to recuperate. Her preparedness came into play then. Neal was gratified by that, for she had brought an authentic mechanical timepiece with her and had retrieved it from the vessel to elucidate the concept of time. Envision, elucidating time, deconstructing the cadence of planetary motion, revolutions, rotation, the diurnal cycle. A notion that typically necessitates instruction to a young child, and here an alien entity with potentially immeasurable intellect had required an explanation. And then it had stipulated the intermission to span 147 minutes. She rose to continue contemplating, but that required some vigorous pacing, and the communications room lacked sufficient space. Thus, she relocated to the erstwhile central common area and lounge, which was slightly less cluttered with additional gear. There was also a markedly higher likelihood of encountering snacks. "Ambassador Neal, incoming transmission." Swiftly, she made her way to the sizable screen mounted on the wall and pressed the illuminated button upon it. The 2-hour span was nearing its end, and a sense of restlessness had taken hold of her. "I'm listening." It was naturally her contact once more. Greetings, Ambassador Neil. I possess a series of directives to assemble and employ a mechanism that will aid your comprehension of the output from the alien translator. As time is of the essence, I would advise commencing without delay. Suggestion accepted. Go ahead. Insert an empty multi-purpose board into the printer and upload the designs I've just transferred over. Adhering to those instructions, she proceeded to the matter printer and retrieved a compact, densely populated circuit board. With care, she inserted it into a holding clip that also functioned as a data transfer port. On a small display adjacent to the printer, she then keyed in a sequence of commands to load and execute the blueprint she had acquired. Without delay, the device commenced its operation, meticulously layering liquefied ceramics, polymers, and any requisite metallic components specified by the blueprint onto and around the board. "What exactly is this object I'm constructing?" Neil inquired, her gaze remaining fixed upon it. Our discovery revealed that the alien translator device produced speech in numerous overlapping layers, with the capability to utter up to 40 distinct lines concurrently. Wait, so I grasped merely a portion of what was conveyed? That's astonishing. However, it did not seem like a jumbled mess. I could distinctly discern brief phrases. The most audible layer is the sole one readily interpretable by human hearing. It constitutes a rather rudimentary précis of every communication. What did it fully say then? I recommend employing the interpreter apparatus from this point onward. However, there is insufficient time to review the audio transcription. The disparity in message duration compared to the synopsis is substantial in the majority of instances. Of course, she cast a glance at the embedded timepiece on the printer's display. She would have merely 3 more minutes remaining. At the very least, the printer head was already performing its final few motions, depositing a concluding layer onto the 2 cable-tethered pieces of apparatus. Moments later, it emitted the auditory signal indicating completion, so Neil retrieved what she identified as an earpiece and a small flat rectangular device, both now gleaming ebony after the brief solidifying interval. Affix the primary component to your suit at a location where it can optimally capture the translator's audio output. The earpiece was crafted to fit comfortably in your right ear. Note that there may be a perceptible time lapse before you hear the complete message, contingent upon the density of the information. The interpreter was engineered adhering to the same non-emission standards as the remainder of your equipment. Okay then, till the next break. Goodbye and good luck. A minute later, Ambassador Neil returned to the meeting room, carrying the translator and with the translator interpreter affixed to her chest plate. The far wall remained opaque, as it had been during her initial visit. However, she noticed that the room's dimensions had shifted slightly. The walls were narrower, the ceiling lower, or perhaps the floor higher. The stool had been replaced by a proper chair with a backrest, upon which rested the clock she had previously set down, appearing undisturbed. Leaving the clock in its place, she remained standing, her anticipation heightened. The pivotal moment arrived shortly after, when the barrier separating the alien entity and her turned translucent. At the very least, she was mentally braced for the unveiling of the immense sentient being that once more fixed its intense, large eyes upon her. It lay in a prone position, resting on its substantial pair of arms, which lent it a somewhat relaxed demeanor. She did take note that the alien translation device felt subtly altered in her grasp now. Salutations once more. The translator's unexpectedly thin voice chimed, and Neil held her breath until she could discern the synthetic voice through the earpiece. A warm welcome back, human representative. I am delighted by your return and trust you have rested and rejuvenated. I reiterate my apologies for necessitating the recess, but I am now prepared to resume our discourse. She was unable to fully suppress her smile. There was an inexplicably great deal of excitement accompanying the human's greeting. There also seemed to be something new about them, Xyloranthar Ven observed. A dark object clung to their attire, suspended on a thin wire that extended from one of the audio-sensory inlets on their head. Naya looked intently, but could not discern its purpose. So she pondered appropriate inquiries. I do not wish to overstep any boundaries again in my curiosity, but I did notice that you have brought a new object with you. It has an unusual and dissonant shape, yet it is exquisitely crafted and marvelous to view up close. Is this something you would like to show me, that is as intriguing as the timekeeping device? I still find that to be fascinating and would be delighted to learn more about the machines humans utilize. After conveying her thoughts to the translator, the human took considerably longer than usual to respond. They had remained motionless for an extended moment before replying, and once more there was a profound sensation of excitement intermingled with exuberance. The human elucidated that the machine was a device that complemented Nia's translator, as it did not communicate in a manner that a human could comprehend adequately. They had constructed it during the rest period, and now they were capable of perceiving all that she uttered. How marvelous, yet also regrettable. Evidently, Nia's translator had not been properly configured, or perhaps she had misinterpreted their audio communication capabilities, necessitating a rectification. She had nearly jeopardized this initial encounter with the humans. Instinctively, Nia clicked in vexation before tensing up. Clicking was considered impolite and decidedly undiplomatic, and she fervently hoped the human would be unable to perceive it. Swiftly, she redirected her thoughts to inquiries regarding the new device as a means to divert attention from her lapse. A sharp, penetrating sub-bass snap that seemed to resonate through her very bones caused Neil to flinch in surprise. It had been barely perceptible, and she could not discern its origin. There was no reaction from the being, and a moment later it felt as though it could have been a mere hallucination. Only after straining her ears did she consciously notice what had been unconsciously nagging at her since boarding this ship. There was an absolute absence of noise, save for her own and the translator's occasional utterances. Despite pondering it at that very instant, she couldn't help but startle once more when its voice broke through her musings. "How were you able to construct it so swiftly?" "It's marvelous that you could compensate for the deficiency of my translator and that you can now grasp me better. I'm truly intrigued to learn how you managed to expeditiously devise and construct this apparatus within the brief time frame I had proposed for the recess." Dismissing that incident and prior thoughts, she began the explanation she had already mentally prepared. "On my ship, I possess a machine capable of weaving metals and plastics to create various building blocks that can be combined to form nearly any kind of small machine or device I may require for this encounter. As I mentioned before, I have sent the audio recording for analysis to my associates, and they have designed this interpreter device to facilitate better understanding between us. The machine then constructed it for me within 2 minutes. However, I can observe that you too possess rapid construction capabilities, as you have transformed this room during my absence." "Shape is easy. Tell more of weaving machine." In her ear, the interpreter elaborated, "This chamber is merely a facade I've constructed to encompass the specialized environment requisite for your well-being. Altering the internal dimensions or overall and intricate shape is an endeavor scarcely worth mentioning. I am intrigued by the matter-weaving apparatus you've described, capable of assembling this interpreter device so swiftly and potentially crafting other machines as well. How did you engineer it to possess the intellectual capacity necessary to comprehend what it is fabricating? And how do you impart it with novel knowledge?" Neil let out a soft exhale through pursed lips. These queries were intricate, and it didn't even explain how it could potentially reshape a space without any technological machinery, seemingly even with ease. That was undoubtedly more intriguing, and she had to restrain herself from inundating the alien with inquiries. Though she was certainly communicating properly now and navigating this diplomatic endeavor adeptly, the impulse to move exerted pressure on her to fidget with her hands, but at the very least, she wasn't pacing from side to side anymore. She needed to maintain simplicity for the time being. That wouldn't prove overly challenging, as she lacked intricate knowledge of the matter printer's inner workings regardless. What in the world was this human prattling about, employing such a multitude of those peculiar terms that Nia could make no sense of, and intermingling them into one prolonged jumble? Processor, motor-driven, computer-designed blueprint. Data storage, touchscreen, molecular fusing, standardized circuit board, polymers, ceramics, and still they droned on incessantly. She had to halt their incoherent rambling. I must apologize, but there are too many terms that I'm struggling to grasp. Perhaps we could revisit this subject at a later time, and for now I'd simply like to understand how humans have constructed the weaving apparatus. Embarrassment? Did she feel her own, or was that stemming from the human's response? They provided a straightforward, yet still perplexing answer. The weaving machine was constructed by other machines. So behind the interpreter machine existed a more intricate and intelligent weaving machine, and behind that was an even more complex and intelligent building machine. She could scarcely fathom how the human had crafted the initial machine, and now she learned of that. It was arduous to restrain herself, so she formulated an exceedingly concise inquiry to prevent anything further from slipping out. How did you build that? There was no feeling she could discern beyond her overwhelming bewilderment. These construction automatons were crafted by yet more automatons. How so? Was this an endless cycle? What degree of intricacy could these machines attain? Naya's form grew heated, merely attempting to comprehend this madness. Did you construct anything? She swiftly clarified, utilizing the very words the human had spoken. With your own hands. The extraterrestrial creature stirred and fidgeted, nearly as much as Neil did at that instant. The motion of the colossal entity, whose eye level matched theirs solely due to the floor behind the transparent barrier, being at least 10 meters below, rendered her immensely unsettled on top of all the other disquieting factors. Well, no, I did not. Interpreter, apparel, weaving machine, ship, built nothing. There was no reason to delay for the translator's involvement. She swiftly clarified. All of these items are constructed by machinery. They possess far greater precision and capability in fabrication compared to our manual efforts with tools. However, they are all derived from our own designs and concepts. And long ago in the past, we did indeed build the initial machines ourselves. An extended stillness ensued, during which the entity raised its gaze, appearing to peer down the passageway that terminated at the docking tunnel behind which her spacecraft resided. Only after several moments devoid of breath did it turn its attention back towards her. Impossible, the translator uttered with a noticeable amount of background noise, so she waited for the delay to subside to comprehend the full message. You claim that you cannot construct the interpreter device, or the weaving apparatus, or the builder machine. Yet complexity can only arise from greater complexity, just as an intelligence cannot create a superior intelligence. You assert that you have built impossibly intricate machines with your own hands, which then constructed the machines you claim to be unable to build due to their complexity. This is a sequence that cannot occur. Truly, I am impressed and fascinated by the machines and objects you have exhibited, and could not replicate them if I exerted the utmost effort. I can only deduce that humans must have emerged after the machines, and you must originate from machines like every other object you have displayed. Neil's thoughts were swirling through these words, and she couldn't find a tranquil place amidst the whirlwind of ideas raging in her mind at the moment. Wasn't she standing aboard a spacecraft capable of traveling between stars, clutching a device that translated whatever inaudible alien mode of communication into her own language? Weren't these machines, highly intricate ones even? All right, first of all, we humans certainly don't originate from machines. Secondly, you've created this. She raised and shook the translator, disregarding whether the action might affect its capacity to render her comprehensible. And this is an immensely intricate machine. It's a device that translates my language into yours and yours into mine. How did you manage to construct this with your less dexterous hands? It started speaking, while she was still waving the device. The translator is straightforward. I have designed and constructed the translator to internally resonate from my thoughts and convert these resonations through the linked substance into motion of the external surface, which generates the kind of atmospheric pressure fluctuations that humans can perceive with their auditory sensory organs. It is a motionless, straightforward, non-intelligent object. What? This is crazy. What about your ship, then? The vessel is uncomplicated, came the same nonsensical response. Shortly after, the interpreter provided the expanded version. My ship encompasses an atmosphere and kinetic setting conducive to my well-being. I have fashioned and constructed it with numerous translators to convert my thoughts into other forms of energy and motion. It remains stationary, straightforward, and devoid of intelligence. Neil's eyes widened at that revelation. She managed to suppress any further undiplomatic displays of astonishment and incredulity, while still essentially trembling inwardly. Carefully choosing her words, she inquired with only a hint of exasperation, "Your technology relies on forms and shapes. If I were to dent the translator, would it cease functioning or what?" "Yes," the translator chirped. "And the same goes for your ship?" "Yes." Neil motioned animatedly around herself, the fleeting degrees of incredulity likely adequate on their own to notably alter the form of this spacecraft by breaching the ceiling. "Yet how is your vessel energized? How does it traverse space without propulsion systems? How do you make all this operational?" The stillness that ensued led her to ponder if she had perhaps gone too far. The massive creature merely gazed motionlessly, leaving no indication whether it was formulating a response or declining to engage. That was, until the translator uttered the most unintelligible words thus far, a torrent of garbled and distorted sounds through which she could merely speculate to have discerned shape. After that, she waited expectantly for the interpreter to clarify what that cryptic statement was meant to convey, but no explanation followed. Exasperated, she found herself pacing unconsciously but quickly halted her steps. Still, she raked her fingers through her hair, gently scratching her scalp. Perhaps this wasn't an appropriate topic for her to dwell on. Maybe it would be better left for the engineers to ponder. Her role was to establish relations, exchange basic information couched in pleasantries, and lay the groundwork for future cooperation. Nya sensed a shared feeling of barely restrained frustration in the human's reply, mirroring her own. They explained that their interpreter machine could not comprehend Nya's explanation of the mathematical principles governing the form of her ship, which enabled her space travel. However, they emphasized that her spacecraft was indeed highly intricate, and humans would be incapable of replicating it. Curiously, they apologized for their language and expressed a desire to discuss simpler matters. Consequently, they inquired about the materials used in constructing her ship. That would certainly be an easier topic to discuss, so Nya complied. It also helped distract her from dwelling further on the paradoxical nature of human machines. She assembled the human words to elucidate, but swiftly realized they lacked many terms to adequately depict the knitting process and its fundamental elements. Perhaps demonstrating it to illustrate the procedure, akin to how they had shown her the timekeeping device, would be the most effective approach. Nya contemplated a form that would be attractive to humans. However, all she had witnessed thus far were combinations of angular and curved shapes, with nothing particularly distinctive. She settled on a straightforward cube with the same volume as the human and the same brilliant white hue as their garments. She shifted the adequate quantity of building blocks along her four limbs and then commenced joining them together bit by bit with her digits, moving them swiftly so the junction would not solidify too soon. It didn't require much time for her to complete the cube, and its accuracy met her approval. A surge of awe and astonishment washed over her well before the human had uttered a single syllable. They appeared to be an unfathomable degree of amazed by the cube she had just crafted. "This is but an empty form, a vacant structure devoid of function, and I've fashioned it solely to illustrate the construction method, as conveying it adequately in your tongue eludes my capabilities." The emotions persisted unabated. The human expressed amazement nonetheless, and could now envision how their vessel had been constructed. They reiterated that humans were incapable of such an achievement, even elaborating that if they raised tens of thousands and possessed the knowledge of its workings, they would still be unable to construct a spacecraft manually. 10,000s, multiples of 10,000. She was aware that there were numerous humans, but they couldn't possibly be that abundant. This novel piece of data pulled her away from the discussion about the construction process. The humans had not been regarded as a threat because they were noisily screeching around space 2 sectors over with only, what Nia had formerly presumed, a few hundred vessels. Could there truly be so many more of them than of her own kind? Her thoughts slipped. How many are you? The human responded promptly. Approximately 22.5 billion. What's the reason for asking? Click. The humans numbered in the billions, tens upon tens of billions, a staggeringly immense population that Xyler Anthar Ven could scarcely fathom, inhabiting not merely 10 worlds but 100. How had this sapient species become so vastly numerous? Did they reproduce at an astonishingly rapid pace? Was this some anomalous breed of prolific breeders that had somehow attained intelligence? For such fecund species were not meant to be intelligent, let alone capable of interstellar travel. This encounter was not proceeding as Nayar had anticipated. Her form had grown rigid since that revelation. These humans possessed a formidable threat with their sheer numbers alone, and they undoubtedly held a technological advantage as well. She was now grateful that she had thus far refrained from divulging extensive information about her species, as what she had already shared posed a sufficient risk. There remained no choice but to conclude this gathering and impart what she had discovered to caution all. She had perpetually presumed that trepidation towards the rapid reproducers was confined to her non-sentient forebears, yet there she stood, unnerved by figures. I hereby adjourn this meeting as I wish to depart promptly. Kindly disembark from my vessel and return to your own without delay, as I require the space you are currently occupying. As expected, the human experienced profound perplexity upon fully comprehending her statements through their translation device, prompting them to endeavor to gain deeper insight into her rationale. Please tell me why, Neil implored once more to the now silent, unmoving alien entity. What misstep had she taken? It was evidently a response to the data regarding the human population count. But why would that information provoke such an abrupt shift in demeanor? Everything had been proceeding smoothly. She had witnessed the aliens' remarkable construction capabilities firsthand. Following that exhibition, she was convinced it could erect any structure it desired using merely its hands. The translator restated its last message. Please, leave. She walked directly up to the transparent barrier to be as near to the sapient alien creature as feasible, gazing straight into 2 of its black eyes. After taking a deep breath, she said, "Very well, I shall depart. But first I wish to impart this to you. I came here with the promise of peace, and I am uncertain why our population size has caused you to turn us away. You must comprehend that, although we may be numerous, right here and right now, we act as a unified whole. Far and wide we have sought intelligent life and other sapient species, and there is nothing else we desire from whomever we may encounter but friendship. If you have found yourself to trust me even the slightest bit, I implore you to extend this trust to all humans and accept that our most sincere wish is for harmony between our species." Neil held her gaze for a full minute before she relented. There would be further opportunities to establish contact with them, and she did not wish to cause a diplomatic incident by overstaying her welcome, so she turned to set down the translator and retrieve the mechanical clock that still rested on the chair. Without glancing back, she began making her way through the hallway toward her ship. Her eyes easily traced the rounded walls and soft curves, running unbroken right up to the point where the human-made docking tunnel connected. It presented quite the contrast in materials, but the metallic ring joined seamlessly with the matte organic-looking surface. There was not the slightest gap visible between them, and they formed an airtight seal without the usual locking mechanisms. She was just about to cross over that link when the childlike voice of the translator called out to her, "Don't." It seemed there was a minimum volume requirement for the interpreter, as it did not activate and stayed quiet. Ambassador Neil then turned around and made his way back into the conference room. "I apologize. My past experiences made me fearful, she said, close enough now to be heard. I'm sorry for my rash reaction, as this is something I did not expect. I had thought humans were a localized hive species with a shared mind and thus a limited population. Now I see that none of my assumptions were accurate. It is deeply ingrained in my biology to be exceptionally wary of small creatures in large numbers, as they were the predators that hunted my ancestors' species. It's difficult to suppress the instinct to avoid being overwhelmed at all costs, and I was seemingly unprepared to handle such an incident. I know my reaction was extreme and likely made little sense, but I ask for your understanding nonetheless. The being, 6 times larger than a human, paradoxically appeared diminutive in that moment. Or was that merely a trick of the mind? Neil was uncertain how to process the explanation. How might she have responded if she had encountered a sentient species that resembled wolves or xenomorphs? Would she have risen above her innate primal instincts? For her, it was evident that this occurrence was simply a misstep on the path to greater comprehension, and without needing to ponder it, she responded, "I'm pleased you've reflected on it, and grateful for your clarification. I now grasp why you reacted as you did, and I see no reason not to pardon you and proceed forward." Neil accentuated her words with a nod, and much to her profound amazement, the wide and flattened cranium of the extraterrestrial being reciprocated the gesture. Prior to her ability to vocalize her awe, the translator emitted, "The entirety of humankind, confined to a singular planetary body?" I too wish to leave that regrettable incident behind, and am thankful for your understanding and pardon. If I may inquire, how have you managed to accommodate such a vast population of humans on your planet Earth? And how do you provide sustenance for so many without depleting your ecosystem? Or do you utilize space-based habitats to expand living space and rely on machines to aid in resource production? Nayar had yet to find relaxation, and hearing the staggering population numbers the humans spoke of certainly did not aid in that endeavor. To begin with, their home planet Earth could apparently sustain the near-incredible number of 14 billion humans, supported by technology and machinery. Spaceships and habitats on otherwise lifeless planets and moons in their system provided abode to nearly 1 billion more. And then came the subsequent surprise. They had colonized 25 planets with a habitable biosphere outside their home system where all the rest dwelled. She had assumed the meaning of colonizing to include creating an ecological environment that would naturally support humans. But would that not utterly devastate those worlds if they already possessed an ecosphere? Perhaps she had misunderstood. Driven by her inquisitiveness, she composed and transmitted the inquiry. How did you select the 25 planets beyond your native system for colonization? And have you discovered any additional worlds that would meet your criteria? And the human elaborated that their primary objective centered around locating planets harboring evolved vegetation. They also expressed openness to encountering fauna, as any creatures they had thus far encountered were remarkably unintelligent. Furthermore, they mentioned having identified approximately 150 additional potential candidates suitable for colonization. Now Nayar's instincts reverted to warning her that the humans posed a threat. They actively sought out living planets to subsequently transport vast numbers of humans there, destroying that life and replacing it with whatever suited their needs. She knew the planets the humans sought were plentiful, but that would surely not safeguard them from eventual depletion. And perhaps these were even the very planets Nayar's species would seek for their independent offspring. I'm curious to understand the colonization and selection process, as well as the locations of the candidate planets you've identified. They began elucidating about scout vessels they would dispatch to survey star systems, venturing outward from their native system at the epicenter of the search radius. However, the process of establishing a settlement sounded unlike anything Nayar would have presumed. Evidently, they would first forge a modest foothold and meticulously study each world prior to fully committing. There was some additional information thereafter, but it comprised terminology about technology she did not comprehend. The salient aspect was, It did not seem as though they would conquer and subjugate those inhabited planets, as she had assumed. With care, she phrased her subsequent inquiry. She wished to maintain a diplomatic approach. "So you do not destroy the ecosystems you convert?" Bewilderment, but then swiftly succeeded by embarrassment. They professed to do their utmost to severely restrict the alterations to worlds they would opt to colonize, seeing as they had virtually precipitated an ecological catastrophe of their own planet when they had still been a single-world species. They dubbed this position the tenet of exoplanet preservation and avowed it would be cherished by all humans. She was amazed by what the human had conveyed to her. Their own world had been so severely impacted by them in the past that they now strived not to harm any other. Though it was not difficult to envision how a species that could proliferate so vastly would pose a threat to the planet on which it evolved. She briefly pictured a horde of millions of humans trampling through lush vegetation, consuming everything, and leaving desolate land in their wake. It was a disturbing image, and she was relieved it did not align with reality. Moreover, they appeared content to remain within the sector where their home system resided. "Well, how many planets do you inhabit, then?" Neil inquired, subtly redirecting the question about population. 1,742. If she hadn't been so stunned, she might have uttered sounds of astonishment. How could this extraterrestrial being harbor fear towards the humans? How numerous were they, inhabiting such a vast multitude of planets? Neil anticipated further elaboration, yet the interpreter remained mute, having conveyed solely that numerical figure. "You have colonized more than 1,700 planets?" "Planets remain uncolonized," the translator conveyed. Moments later, the synthetic voice echoed through her earpiece. "My kind does not colonize planets, for we have no necessity for it. There exists but a single independent youth of my species, inhabiting each planet apart from our world of origin." That explanation merely raised further queries that lingered unspoken. Were there truly youngsters who dwelled on worlds beyond their own, entirely unaccompanied? Neil's restlessness had resurfaced, though the timepiece in his grasp provided a welcome diversion as he repeatedly turned it over, tapping lightly upon its crystalline surface. "With diplomacy," she inquired, "perhaps I'm misinterpreting due to lack of context or by drawing parallels to my own society, but could you please expound on your statement regarding certain children being housed in planetary isolation?" Amidst the cacophony, the translator's voice resonated, yet she could scarcely comprehend the two uttered words. "All children." Swiftly her hand moved to the earpiece, firmly pressing it against her head as she calmly uttered the words, "You'd better comprehend the essence of that thoroughly." The moments ticked by, stretching the stillness. When what seemed an eternity had elapsed, she could no longer bear the suspense. "Could you please simplify your answer?" "Younglings require room for learning," the translator elaborated. "The offspring of my kind are afforded the expanse of an entire world to acquire knowledge and mature, a crucial necessity for mental and biological growth." "I require further clarification to comprehend," Neil remarked, attempting to conceal her perplexity. "As human children are continuously nurtured and supported by their parents and society until they reach full maturity." The extraterrestrial being performed another of its eye-shifting maneuvers by rotating its head. Neil interpreted this as a gesture of disapproval, or at the very least it conveyed that impression to him. "Perhaps it would be best if we began at the beginning, and you explained to me the process of how your species reproduces and the duration involved," she proposed, swiftly appending, "though I ask that you remain mindful of the constraints of my translation capabilities." "I make my children," was understandable but interspersed with a fair bit of garbled utterances. A few moments later, she got to hear the detailed version. "When I am biologically prepared, I may freely initiate the involuntary movement of embryonic organ seeds that will gather in a fetal pouch located on my back. Over an average span of 3,700 days, the organ seeds will mature and a complete nervous system will develop. Then I will commence the teaching, while the dependent offspring encapsulates itself into a body and is sustained by my nutrient circulation system. After 4,000 to 4,300 additional days, the offspring will be capable of supporting itself autonomously, at which point I will release it into a world where it will grow to full bodily and mental maturity. I have witnessed my 6 offspring successfully reach this stage and create means to depart their cradle world. The duration of that process is determined by the planetary environment, and the juvenile and may last from 18,000 to 24,000 days. Creating offspring is highly demanding in energy and mental capacity and is limited by my capabilities and the duration of the regrowth of the embryonic organ seeds, which will take 20,200 days. The timepiece slipped from her grasp and landed softly on the floor. Neil could only make a rough estimation in her mind, but the duration the extraterrestrial had mentioned for the birthing cycle seemed to be around 80 years from beginning to end. And this entity had claimed to have undergone this process 6 times. The latter revelation had actually stunned her more than the former. "How old are you, actually?" Ambassador Neil reclined in the swivel chair, enveloped in a hazy stillness. She had already transferred the recordings and provided all the instructions she could muster about analyzing them to her point of contact. Now she awaited verification. A side screen displayed the transcript of the dialogue before the break and a compendium of information on the alien translator, yet she lacked the mental capacity to comprehend either at that moment. Those last couple of hours had felt like they dragged on for at least a week, perhaps because they had been filled with enough novelty for a lifetime. The sound from the control panel drew her attention away from her musings. "The recordings have been successfully obtained. Are there any further directives you wish to provide?" "Not right now." "I will disconnect then." "Yeah, sure. See you on the next scheduled check-in." She replied in a vaguely agreeing noise. After a brief interval, she rose to locate the vessel's automated culinary facility. At present, she required a refreshingly chilled beverage, a piping hot protein-laden repast, and a sugary, indulgent confection, in that particular sequence. As the water dispenser filled her cup, she pondered the latest revelation she had learned, after which the alien had asked for an extended respite to recuperate, as though Neil could have absorbed much more in any case. She had gradually come to view it as an equal, notwithstanding the disparities. Yet how could they truly be equals when that entity was nearly as ancient as the Renaissance era? 998 years to be exact. Steady harmonic vibrations moved in unison through the cool darkness, their shifting interference creating an evolving picture that felt three-dimensional in its acoustic depth. Scattered throughout were soft pings that made spots of light in the ambience which flickered into existence and dissipated swiftly. At times, a high note drew a clear, shimmering streak across the flowing randomness, like a falling water droplet. Gradually and subtly, the ensemble lowered its volume, until after many moments, only pure silence lingered. A profound and weighty awareness stirred within the void that remained, gradually unraveling the tangled mass of thoughts and shedding light upon the surrounding consciousness. Zyla Anthar Ven emerged from her meditative repose and, before all else, assessed her ship and environs. She swiftly determined that all was well, and the human spacecraft still hung motionlessly beside her own. 311 minutes of rest had elapsed, providing her with renewed mental vigor. There remained time, yet tasks awaited. For one, she had to reshape the visitor's chamber and infuse the special ambiance required by the human. Additionally, she wished to address her translator's issue and refine it. Presently, she desired a refreshing beverage, despite her energy reserves being ample for an extended period. Thus, she reshaped the adjacent wall outlet and imbibed a small portion of the sweet liquid before resealing it. Now, regarding the translator, she opened her eyes and illuminated her chamber with a thought, then retrieved the tiny disc she had affixed to the wall. Meticulously, she analyzed its structure and contemplated further the mechanism humans utilized for communication and what she had gleaned from direct observation. Their method of generating air vibrations operated vastly differently from how they perceived them. The translator's design was founded upon a reversal of the latter, as it did seem the more efficient approach, especially since it did not necessitate moving the air itself. Nya realized after a moment's contemplation that the issue had not been the method of generating vibrations, but rather her own misapprehensions regarding the constraints of information density. Since humans could only produce a singular sequence of vocalizations in their language, it followed logically that their capacity would be restricted to comprehending a single sequence as well, despite their mechanical ability to perceive a high density of parallel inputs, approaching the manner in which she would communicate with her own kind. If she wished to convey their language in a more human-like manner, this translator would prove inadequate. Its transformation capabilities were too expansive, making it challenging for her to remain within the confines of the single-string output she desired. However, redesigning the internal components was not feasible, as it was a blend of flexible and rigid structures. Consequently, she crushed and melted it within her grasp, reabsorbing the foundational elements. Thereafter, she summoned fresh components to her fingertips and commenced constructing a new translator along an enhanced design. A mug containing the dregs of a tepid black beverage sat on an indented coaster beside the physical keyboard of the console. Two displays were active, both filled with diagrams, text, and images of indistinct objects. Neil was perusing and scarcely comprehending the analysis report on the alien translation device. The summary had not quenched her initial curiosity about the alien being's construction capabilities, or perhaps she ought to consider it as near and chap now. She had indeed gleaned the extraterrestrial entity's name from the transcripts, albeit she needed to listen to the isolated audio clip in order to attempt repeating it, yet she remained quite uncertain about the accurate pronunciation. As she had gleaned from the report, which essentially constituted a research paper with numerous names attached, the entire exterior of the alien device was fashioned from a hydrocarbon polymer lattice that exhibited a near-flawless repeating structure at the micrometer scale, and bore a slight resemblance to an organic cellular structure. The composition varied along the disc shape, seemingly contingent on the desired mechanical properties of the macromaterial. The paper mentioned several distinct lattice structure archetypes, each displaying sub-variants that, coupled with the material thickness, fine-tuned the properties to a degree that vastly outstripped anything human-made from single materials. Noticeable, too, was the overall shape. While Neil had thought it to be a circular disc, it was slightly off from a perfect circle, and the material structure was not entirely symmetrical radially either. About the internal molecular composition there was no information, the scanner having apparently been able to do little more than a surface material analysis due to the thickness and density of the outer layer. But judging by the versatility of this polymer lattice, it would be a fair assumption that the whole thing was made from it. Pondering the vast disparity in scale, that translator must have seemed infinitesimal to it, yet it had fashioned an artifact that Neil would deem immensely more intricate than either the mechanical timepiece or the interpreter device, both of which had left it deeply impressed for reasons now unfathomable. Glancing at the time displayed on one of the view screens, she realized she had under half an hour remaining until the upcoming meeting, enough time to suit up in her multi-purpose pressure gear equipped with the interpreter and touch base with her point of contact prior to venturing aboard that alien vessel once more. "Salutations, human ambassador, and welcome aboard once more," a voice resonated, distinctly different from the one she had previously heard. Neil was so taken aback, she halted in her steps a few paces into the hallway. What she had heard seemed somewhat reminiscent of her own voice, though richer and slightly lower in pitch. From this vantage point, she could already discern that the meeting chamber barrier was see-through. With a hint of puzzlement, she proceeded toward it, where a white cube stood about waist-high beside a cozy-looking chair, upon which rested a translator device of a contrasting hue. Two dark eyes were already focused on her, naturally belonging to the immense being behind the partition. Once more it appeared to calmly recline upon its limbs and to position its head precisely at Neil's eye level. "Hello to you as well. I'm pleased to return, and I am certainly refreshed. If I may inquire, have you developed a new translation device? It was certainly the novel amber-hued disc that uttered, "Indeed, I've now perceived the constraints of my comprehension and the prior translation apparatus. Thus I have adopted an altered mode of conveying the words of your tongue and constructed this new device that will interpret my contemplations precisely and straightforwardly." Undoubtedly, the speech emanated from the translator with absolute clarity, devoid of any distortion or ambient noise, and noticeably amplified in volume. Her interpreter remained silent, having no remarks to offer. Neil was utterly astonished by the remarkable swiftness with which that entity had not merely conceptualized, but also constructed an entirely new translator, particularly after gaining insight into the incredibly intricate composition of the previous one. As she took off the earpiece and detached the flat rectangular main unit of the interpreter from her chest, she remarked with praise, "Your construction skills and the swiftness with which you can craft things truly impress me. Might you share if this translator device is fashioned from the same substance as the previous one?" "This is the sole substance available for construction, and all that I construct is fashioned from it." "Your whole spaceship is made from the same stuff the translator is." "I've constructed the framework and form of my vessel from this substance too. However, there are other constituents encased within my ship that I require to uphold my welfare and generate propulsion. From those, I also derive the elements to fashion the ambience and circumstances vital for your well-being." Neil set the interpreter down on the chair next to the translator, as she had already wound a length of cable around her finger. Much to her pleasure, this new voice was far more pleasant to listen to than the previous one, yet she still felt as though she had served as a model for its creation. From the ancient translator, human researchers were able to discern that the molecular configuration is remarkably unique and intricately intricate. They inferred that its purpose stemmed exclusively from its arrangement within the apparatus, precisely as you've conveyed to me. I'm curious to learn how you managed to construct this structure at the molecular scale. How do you manipulate it to attain the desired form? A pause ensued before the translator's voice broke the stillness. "There are no words in the human tongue that can adequately convey it, I'm afraid." "In that case, employ some phrases from your native tongue, and I may be capable of comprehending the context. The manner in which my kind conveys thoughts does not employ the same level of abstraction that humans utilize through the medium of language. There exist no words within my native tongue that I could offer as substitutes for those which you lack." "You don't use words to communicate. My kind possesses the capacity to convey knowledge and lived experiences without necessitating their presence." Now she felt the urge to occupy her hands by picking up the interpreter once more. However, what it had conveyed didn't entirely make sense, prompting Neil's objection. "But you do possess words. You provided me with your name, Near and Chap." A slight shift in its body stance proceeded before it responded, "You had inquired for a name, as you humans have a distinct designation for every individual. My kind does not require names, as I recognize each one and they know me. When you asked for my name, I could only recall the sound I had been addressed by during my development phase on the form of my progenitor, and that is Xyler Anthar Ven." While it had conveyed its name through the translator, Neil could discern a faint, low-frequency hum without a distinct source. Focusing instead on elevating the level of courtesy once more, she commenced explaining, "I cannot fathom being without words. The human thought process is profoundly shaped by the manner in which we communicate, and even my internal musings are largely structured around my language. I apologize for presuming you would share the same foundation." Then she made her utmost effort to repeat the name, Nirhan Jeb. "There's no requirement for an apology, since I haven't informed you about any of these matters thus far, and you're welcome to address me as Niar." "Thank you, Nayar. Then you can call me Kala." How peculiar it was to consider a being not by its very essence, but as a detached one-word designation. Yet Nayar understood that for a species comprising countless individuals, a straightforward identification system was imperative, and it only made sense that it would derive from the language they employed. Then her line of thinking faltered. Swiftly, she relayed her thoughts to the translator, one word at a time. "You've merely given me words for communication in your language. However, I have yet to learn the words you employ as names. Am I lacking 22,500,000,000 names?" Amusement tinged the reply that there were not. Evidently, there existed a number of designated human forename words, a few 100,000 at most, that were then coupled with a surname from another collection of words designated for that purpose, only partially overlapping with the former. Carla elucidated that the resulting full name would then serve as the official identifier of a specific human, though she mentioned that conforming to the common name words was not obligatory amongst humans, and cited the example of colonists of a planet in their home system who had a tradition of names comprising seemingly random letter and number combinations. More than just one forename or surname could also be employed in tandem, as names carried ancestral significance. And they went on to explain that typically one would be addressed by others using their first or last name, though some might opt for an entirely different name that may or may not derive from their official names. Carla then cited her own name as an example, which was officially Calantha Daniela Neal, comprising two first names and a surname, yet she preferred the shortened form Carla, based on Calantha. "Is your full name then the sole unique identifier by which all humans could recognize you?" Their response indicated uncertainty about whether that was indeed the situation, further noting that even complete names were not necessarily unique identifiers among all living individuals. So that entire perplexing, irrational tangle was not even practical for distinguishing an individual among humans. Nayar almost blurted out the inquiry of why they depended on such an intricate and disjointed system, if that was indeed the case. Seeming to recognize the need for further explanation, Kyla mentioned that names were coupled with additional details to enable that distinct identification in formal matters. She also noted that other contextual information, combined with the name, was typically adequate to recognize an individual previously encountered when attempting to communicate specifics about any person. Even so, Nia remained uncertain of what to express. She had desired to learn the designations of all the humans after grasping the notion, but now she questioned whether it would prove as beneficial as she had envisioned. The translator spoke loudly. "I would appreciate if you could furnish me with the names of all humans, just as you have provided the language details. I wish to learn them, yet I perceive no efficient means to convey this extensive vocabulary through direct conversation." "What?" Neil's voice trailed off. "They desired to learn the names of all humans, as in the full names of 22.5 billion individuals." She double-checked by inquiring of Nayar. "I apologize, I don't believe I comprehend. Do you seek a list of all the names we utilize, or do you desire a list of the names of every single human being?" "To elucidate my prior question, I am requesting the semi-distinctive complete name designator for each individual person." "Well, you see," she ran her fingers through her curly locks, "that may not be feasible. Even in my role as a first contact ambassador, I believe I'd face difficulties in accessing all those details." "Are you unaware?" inquired the translator. She sensed a hint of accusation, yet the voice from this apparatus, though more pleasing in tone, remained devoid of feeling. "Do you mean if I can recall every individual's name? I have an excellent memory for names, but spontaneously I may be able to recollect a few hundred people along with their names if given sufficient time, though certainly less than 1,000 and absolutely not 22 billion. I struggle to comprehend the purpose of employing names to distinguish individual humans if one is unaware of those names and thus unable to identify them. How does one initiate communication if unable to address them or recognize their identity?" Once more, Neil found himself compelled to start moving about restlessly. "I don't quite understand. You were unaware of anything about me when we initially encountered each other, correct? Yet we still commenced conversing," she remarked, simultaneously cognizant that their interaction had been rather strained prior to her utilizing the interpreter's services. "I was informed that a member of the human race would arrive at this meeting place. While I acknowledged that I would have no prior knowledge about the representative or your kind, as this marks our inaugural encounter, I presumed that being a single individual from your species, you would be acquainted with the identities of all others belonging to it. Neil paused for a moment. Had Nayar truly meant what they had expressed earlier? Did their species continuously learn about every other individual, potentially without even intending to meet them? Gradually, it occurred to her that their population count must be quite low to make that feasible, a conclusion further supported by the total number of all their children being in the 1700s. She clarified, typically humans only commit to memory the names of a small number of distinguished individuals if they haven't actually met them. In most cases, we learn someone's name directly from that person after having already engaged in interaction with them. Do you have communicated with less than 1,000 humans? Ah, I see. She swiftly considered how to explain. While humans may interact with numerous individuals, if there's no requirement to exchange names for potential future interactions, we typically don't. I must have encountered several thousand humans in the 2 days prior to our meeting, yet only a handful actually provided me with their names. Having said that large number in connotation with the short time frame, Nayar involuntarily envisioned a swarm of them scurrying on the ground, around and beneath her. It was a severely unpleasant mental image and caused her to tense up reflexively. To distract herself, she attempted to concentrate on that whole naming and identity concept. Those seemed heavily intertwined, but any given human individual only knew a number of others to whom they had direct connections. How then could a representative of the humans even exist if they could not possibly know all the other humans and comprehend their desires and aspirations? Did all of this relate to their immense population size? Though she didn't have the chance to voice her wish for more details on that subject, when Carla inquired, tinged with keen inquisitiveness, to proceed discussing Nayar's age, they swiftly furnished the information that Nayar seemed to be 100 years older than humanity's capacity to rapidly reproduce their initial widespread means of external data storage. Taken aback by the abrupt shift, as well as slightly puzzled by the shared details, she relayed a message to the translator. I regret to inform you that I am unaware of the importance of this occurrence or the reason behind providing this particular piece of information. Carla started elucidating that the human realm had been immensely disparate during the epoch when Nayar had emerged into existence. They conversed about matters she failed to comprehend the significance of, seemingly portraying technology. It did little to furnish an elucidation. Nayar put together a question to ask back. Mid-utterance, the interpreter interjected, I'm afraid I cannot comprehend the relevance of you sharing details from your history with me. Neil folded her arms across her chest, then let them drop to her sides, before running her fingers through her hair, all in the span of a couple of seconds. How could she broach the inquiry she truly wished to pose without first providing some background? She gave up and bluntly threw out, Nayar, how old can you get? I can reach 999 years of age. That's your current age. I mean, how advanced can one become before passing away due to old age? I do not understand the question. Why would Kayla inquire if she could perish? Certainly she was capable of dying. It would be effortless even, considering her present surroundings, the vacuum and frigidity of the cosmic expanse. She possessed the recollections of those who had perished and knew the manner in which they had succumbed. But none such as that query implied. Was that a cause of demise among humans, death from old age? How many had expired from that to pique Carla's curiosity, if it befell Nayar as well? She responded to the translator, Certainly I am capable of dying. 713 members of my species have perished, for various reasons that I shall not delve into. I believed it was evident that my vessel is present to safeguard my well-being during my journeys through the cosmos. Without it, I would be unable to endure. If I may inquire, how many humans have succumbed to the effects of age? A profound sense of bewilderment emanated from Carla, and the sole response was that all humans had perished due to old age, except for those presently living. I'm afraid I cannot place your remark in a situation where I could grasp the implications. As Kyla began explaining, the perplexity persisted regarding the human's finite lifespan, which for the present one spanned a maximum of 160 years. Moreover, she mentioned that this lifespan had been even shorter for humans in the past, including recent times. To illustrate, they cited Nayar as an example, stating that had she visited Earth just a sixth of her current age earlier, the entire human population would have comprised entirely different individuals. Nayar was astonished. This could scarcely be accurate. This would signify that there had been billions upon billions of deaths among the humans. Hundreds of billions of fatalities. The tally of deceased of her own kind was negligible in comparison, and even the number of all living individuals paled. How could a sapient species not crumble and disintegrate under such an onslaught of death? She could scarcely fathom what it would be like for an individual, knowing they would simply expire at some juncture, not even through some external force, but for no discernible reason. The ramifications were so vast, she could not formulate the thoughts swiftly enough. "So you just die?" This time she certainly did not imagine it. The voice resonated with utter disbelief, and Ambassador Neal could sense the same astonishment. Not only was this entity before her inconceivably ancient, having potentially witnessed the entirety of modern human history and beyond, but it seemingly had no bounds to its age. Neal could scarcely fathom a species of immortal beings. How would that even function in a society, or in evolutionary terms? Perhaps that was the reason Nayar was so knowledgeable and highly skilled in constructing spaceships and equipment. Boundless time for education. It did give him novel ideas about the population size of her species, for if none of them perished of age, the potential growth rate would be much higher. Though Nayar had mentioned the deceased of her kind, and that number was actually startlingly low, how could she explain that those 700 deaths would not even account for the humans expiring within any given hour of the day? "No, She faltered over the words she wanted to use and sank heavily into the chair as she contemplated a better way to explain it. Humans cease growing after reaching adulthood, but the body doesn't stop changing. That's what we call aging. I believe it has something to do with the biochemistry within our bodies and cells that causes it. We have medicine now to slow that decline and postpone the aging process. But still, there are only around 40 years after maturity where our bodies will remain more or less the same. After that, there are 40 to 60 more years where we will just gradually deteriorate overall. Muscles will become weaker, bones more brittle, skin saggier, organs won't function at full capacity, even the brain will get worse at processing and retaining information. And then there is a final sharp decline where each year could be the last. All the organs have become so compromised that even mild external factors could cause them to fail, and we are too frail to handle day-to-day living on our own. If we survive through that, there will still come a point where the decline has progressed so far that our body itself will not be able to sustain all the processes necessary to keep functioning. Then we simply die. Nayar had moved so near to the clear partition, its head was almost touching it. Yet it stayed quiet, seemingly unsure of what to utter. So Neal added, "Immortality, which I mean not dying of age, has been a staple of human imagination for a long time. But even after so many technological advances, we've still only postponed it. Personally, I would just like to have the choice. What if life is so fascinating that I don't want to depart? Or after 1,000 years it turns out I'm utterly bored? I can't fathom not having the end of my life somewhere in my thoughts. But perhaps it's also what drove humans so far, the wish to accomplish more within a lifetime, or simply the desire to leave something meaningful behind." The emotions emanating from Carla were so profound, Nayar herself was overwhelmed by the wistfulness and melancholy. When they had conversed, she had actually witnessed a human life unfolding before her, a radiant light shining steadily, then gradually dimming over time, soon wavering uneasily in shadows, and ultimately fading into nothingness in the end. How could they endure with that, having the constraint of 140 years? Or was it, as Carla had proposed in the end, actually a strength? If time was finite, was there not more impetus to make the most of it? to constantly strive forward. The subject of inescapable demise did not appear enticing to ponder upon. She typically avoided contemplating the 713 of her kind that had perished or the 1,530 that were unaccounted for. And she presumed it would be similar for Carla, who must be acquainted with numerous humans that had succumbed to this age-related death. Shifting the topic would not be overly difficult, as this fresh information did render the human population figure even more remarkable. They did eventually pass away, and were then incapable of producing further offspring. How did they elevate their numbers to 22 billion and 500 million if it required them 20 years to bring a human to full maturity? For a moment she was captivated by the vision of offspring emerging from human forms, shortly before those humans simply disintegrated into dust, after which the newly matured ones produced offspring and then perished, and so forth. A cycle of constant growth, merely to gradually raise the population. But was it truly so? A query naturally arose that came forth. How frequently do you bear young within a lifespan? A fair bit of surprise accompanied the response that the number of children varied based on diverse factors, and that Carla was unaware of the precise figure. However, they did provide an approximation of around 2.5 children on average. That implied there were 3 additional humans for every pair that perished, which was at the very least a population growth of 50% within a human lifespan. That did seem completely dreadful. So Nayar was uncertain if this merited another wave of apprehensive panic, because this had to be implausible. Before she could ponder more, Carla noted that they had neglected to inform Nayar that 2 humans were invariably involved in the process of producing offspring, and merely half of them possessed the capacity to bear children. Thus, the number of offspring would be reduced by half if attributed to a solitary human. 2 people participated in conceiving a child, yet only one carried it to term. What was the peculiarity with human reproductive biology? She was aware of species on inhabited worlds that required a joint effort to reproduce, but in those cases, both parties produced offspring. Were half of all humans sterile? At any rate, Nayar had now fully abandoned her prior line of thinking. I must inquire for additional information regarding the reproductive process of humans. What is the reason behind half of your population being incapable of conceiving offspring, and what role do they play in the act of procreation? That inquiry was among the major ones Neil had readied herself for, yet simultaneously wished to avoid addressing. It appeared that the human approach to childbearing was considerably more involved and corporeal when contrasted with Nayar's method of procreation. She ought to refrain from delving into specifics during this inaugural interaction with a novel sapient species, adhering instead to the rudimentary fundamentals. Neil opted to remain seated when she began explaining. Most species on Earth are dioecious, meaning they comprise 2 subsets of individuals called male and female. These differ at least in their reproductive organs, and in most dioecious species also through other biological traits. The female role in reproduction is to carry the female-specific cells that may potentially develop into offspring. Males have a different type of reproduction-relevant cells, and only a combination of both, called fertilization, will turn the female-specific cell into a zygote, the initial developmental stage for a new individual. From then on, the zygote must be provided nourishment to grow from a single-celled organism into an offspring capable of independent life. In humans, this process occurs inside the female body in an organ called the uterus, commonly producing a single offspring that may become either male or female in an even distribution. So the development of a new human begins with fertilization and ends with birth, the expulsion of the offspring from the uterus when it reaches around 4.5% of the female's mass. In humans, this entire process takes an average of 280 days. Are humans capable of reproducing every 280 days, or perhaps even more rapidly with multiple offspring from a single fertilization? The translator inquired promptly. Well, no, she considered how to explain it. Humans typically form pairs, usually one female and one male, to create and subsequently nurture offspring together. Biologically, it's something like 40 to 60 days after birth when the female could theoretically become pregnant again, which means carrying a developing child. But those pairs will usually avoid attempts at successful fertilization until much later, as the infant, the independent but underdeveloped offspring, requires a great deal of care and will still be directly nourished by the female. This occurs through mammary glands that secrete a liquid that will be the basis of nourishment for the offspring for the first 240 days or so. This can be substituted or supplemented by an artificial alternative if necessary. Neil straightened up slightly as he tried to recall what he had read about birth statistics, but the details eluded him, so he opted to keep it brief. The occurrence of multiple offspring is quite uncommon, with less than 4% of births resulting in more than one child, and most of those cases involve twins. While there are instances of higher-order multiple births, biological limitations make it rare for all of those offspring to develop properly before delivery. However, I'm not certain about the specifics or exact figures. A period of quietness ensued, which at the very least assured her that there wouldn't be a jumbled confusion arising from the translator. However, it was indeed a substantial amount of information she had just imparted, even without delving into any intricate details regarding either conception or the birthing process. After around a minute, Nia spoke through the translator. "If I'm comprehending this correctly, the females of your species are actually the ones who bear more humans, while the males merely contribute their specialized cells? Please expand on the evolutionary rationale behind this division of your species into subgroups, as I only perceive the drawback of half the individuals being incapable of producing offspring, thereby halving the potential population growth rate." While Carla couldn't fully clarify the question about this division, as they professed limited knowledge of the biological intricacies, they did employ several terms that Nia struggled to comprehend in their attempt to provide a partial explanation. Once more, after acknowledging their lack of understanding, Carla tinged their response with a hint of embarrassment. What Nia did grasp was the reality that humans were not a single kind of being, but rather two distinct ones that depended upon the other to sustain their respective types. A phenomenon she had never witnessed in other species before, neither on her species' homeworld nor on any other living planet. The humans possessed so many layers of novelty that her mind would likely never cease spinning if she had learned it as swiftly as she could acquire knowledge from her own kind. Fortunately for her sanity, this mode of communication was a gradual process. Following a brief contemplative moment, she relayed a straightforward inquiry through the translator. "If you don't mind me asking, what exactly is your nature, and how might you differ from the other variety of human beings?" Carla replied with a wave of excitement that she had prepared for this and needed to fetch something from her ship. Without delay, they then hurried off to return less than a minute later, Carla holding a rectangular metallic plate that reflected the light in a pleasant yellow tint. There were fine lines etched into the plate that Nia could not discern until Carla held it up before her with both hands, inquiring if she could perceive it clearly. Besides other diagrams, two figures that strongly resembled Carla were depicted with a rectangle between them that most certainly was a representation of the metallic plate itself, as she deduced from the markings on it and its relative size. Carla then elucidated that this was intended as a gift for Nia, serving as a knowledge repository on the appearance and origins of humans. It had been crafted to impart information through simple visuals, circumventing potential communication barriers. Carla gestured towards the two figures, explaining that they depicted an average representation of a male and female human. Furthermore, Carla added that they themselves were female, the childbearing type of the human species. Those two figures bore a striking resemblance to her, yet they were notably distinct from one another. Such biological variances likely stemmed from some evolutionary rationale that Nia couldn't fathom at present. Perhaps she'd gain insight after acquiring more knowledge about their planet Earth and the other species inhabiting it. A notion crossed her mind, which she promptly articulated. If the female humans are the ones who bear and nurture young, then my kind is akin to them in that regard. Something exceptional transpired next, which Nayar was utterly unprepared for. Kyla affirmed that this was indeed the case, and that Nayar was a mother. This term she did not comprehend, yet there was such an overwhelming and radiant blend of positive emotions that emerged as Kyla had uttered it. Nayar could not discern specific ones from the intertwined, gleaming array. A mother was evidently something tremendously precious for humans. "I would like that," came the reply. It felt peculiar to associate a term so intimately linked to human families with Nayar, a sentient being from an immensely different species that had only one gender and reproduced asexually. How strange yet captivating to consider this immortal alien entity, several times her size and capable of constructing spaceships with its own appendages, as simply a mother of 6 with whom she was conversing. Neil contemplated whether to elaborate further on the distinctions between biological sexes, or if this initial explanation would be adequate for their first encounter. After placing the golden plaque down on the chair, its face oriented towards Nayar, she opted to let her decide if she needed more information. "Do you want to know more about females, males, or human reproduction? Could you elaborate further on the paired units you mentioned, as there appears to be a notable emphasis placed on the female who has borne children, whom you referred to as a mother?" She began gesturing with her hands as she elaborated. Both parental figures play a crucial role in a child's upbringing. Typically, it involves a male and female pairing, the male being referred to as the father. However, 2 females or 2 males may also form a parental unit, and, pausing briefly, she opted to keep it straightforward and avoid delving into the intricacies of diverse family structures, continuing with, "And the parents impart their knowledge and experiences to their child or children, leaving an indelible mark on them for life. This relational dynamic is known as a family and holds immense significance for nearly all humans. Do you share a similar bond with your progenitor or offspring?" After a brief pause, the translator spoke. "Yes, there is indeed a similarity to what you have described and my own species. My ancestor imparted selective experiences and knowledge to me, so that I could become independent in learning and growing on a cradle planet. Once I reached physical and mental maturity and returned to the origin world, I learned everything else from my species, including the collective memories of every individual. I am certain my ancestors' influence on me was profound, as I was chosen to represent my species due to how I handled that time of independent growth when I was fully reliant on what she had taught me." This revelation filled Neil with a multitude of queries. However, she composed herself and focused on the burning inquiry that consumed her thoughts the most. "Does this mean you possess knowledge of all your ancestors' actions?" "To a near-complete degree, yes. Say, your most ancient forebearer, the primordial one of your kind. Are you familiar with its existence?" She then swiftly amended. "Her existence, I should say." "Yes, she is the ancestor to all individuals of my species." That sudden burst of surprise struck her so intensely, she couldn't even make out the words as she uttered, "Could you describe her to me? What kind of person was she?" The response took such a prolonged time, Neil had grown concerned that she had requested too much. Yet this was simply mind-boggling. How incredibly intriguing it would be to gain knowledge of the very first human. How dissimilar would the humans be, if there remained more from the distant antiquity than mere vague pictograms and a handful of words of long-forgotten significance carved into stone. She observed Nayar divert her eyes just before the translator uttered, "I'm unsure how to articulate the existence of the primordial ones, as there was never a necessity to translate recollections into verbal form previously. Kindly share with me the details of her formative years, when she was the sole member of your kind. Recount the significant occurrences, along with her experiences and actions during that period. Certainly I shall endeavor to articulate it in a coherent manner. The primordial member of my species was brought into existence by a non-sentient progenitor that was biologically akin to my kind. This antecedent had scant wisdom to impart to the inaugural one, prior to her attaining independence and being dispatched to mature and acquire knowledge autonomously. You should be aware that the primordial world was perilous during that era, due to the existence of a predatory species of prolific breeders that hunted both the non-sentient forebears and the first one. They would congregate and hunt in packs, rendering the greater relative size and physical prowess of their prey inconsequential. Solitary movement and concealment of her presence had been imparted to the first one as the optimal defense against those predators. Thus the first one sought refuge within the dense woodland where she imbibed from the trees and flourished. The origin world experiences a recurring cycle of a period with moderate temperatures and high rainfall that fosters abundant growth, followed by decreasing temperatures and dryness, and then a time of intense sandstorms that devastate the plants and forests. The first one had also learned about this cycle and that she had gained independence near the end of the abundant period. Thus, she had to prepare during the cooling phase for the immense sandstorms to come. Through close observation of other life forms and her surroundings, the first one acquired knowledge of efficient evolutionary design principles and went on to utilize this understanding to resourcefully create shelter to endure the storms. During the abundant period that ensued, the first one focused on gaining more knowledge from nature and traveled vast distances to observe as much as possible of the forests. Through these observations, she learned of many things and began perceiving the governing principles of mathematics in the design of life. However, she also became aware of the forest boundaries, beyond which lay seemingly endless sands. It was also during this time that she frequently had to evade the swift breeders, and she witnessed many of my non-sapient ancestor species that had fallen prey to them. There was a momentary silence. Neil envisioned those recollections becoming ingrained within Nayar herself, which would undoubtedly bring about immense unease if she dwelled on the perils of times gone by. Nearing the end of this second abundant period, the first one happened upon an ongoing attack, witnessing her own direct progenitor striving to defend itself. She went to assist and attempted to trample as many of the swiftly multiplying adversaries as possible, but they proved agile enough to evade most of her assaults. After her ancestor ultimately succumbed, the first one fled as she had become the predator's target. Utilizing her knowledge of nature and the forest, she had managed to elude them. The energy expenditure of these actions was substantial and hindered her preparations for the impending period of intense sandstorms. However, the ingenuity of the initial one allowed her to endure the storms once more and witness the subsequent time of plenty. She contemplated the insights she had gained and the observations she had made, conjecturing that the forest, despite its vastness, did not provide adequate space for the species residing within to evolve and thrive. So the initial traveler journeyed to the forest's edge to observe the sands, beyond which she suspected fertile lands with additional forests lay, and resolved to seek them out. Swiftly replenishing her nutrient reserves, the first one set forth on the journey while still within the third season of plenty, leaving the forest behind. To guide her way, she observed the sun's movement during the day and the stars' motion during the night, learning their predictable patterns. Another pause. Nia shifted her gaze. I must confess, the memories of the time that ensued are not in a way I can describe, but I will recount what I have deduced myself. The first one roamed until the midpoint of the sun's journey was nearly overhead, finding nothing and nearly succumbing to the heat of the sands at that juncture. Since her nourishment reserves were already inadequate for a return, she pressed on until she had finally spotted something disrupting the horizon. These were the hardened remnants of long-deceased trees protruding from what had been a formidable hilltop that had not been completely subsumed by the great sandstorms. Perceiving nothing else but lifeless sands and losing full grasp on her faculties, the first one grew fearful and turned back. The struggle of the journey back to the forest remains incomplete and scarcely comprehensible, as the first one had not been fully conscious for most of it. She did, however, return to the forest, nearing starvation and at the conclusion of the third season of abundance. The first one could barely prepare for the storms this time around, and was once more on the brink of death before the fourth season of abundance commenced. It was at this juncture that she had transformed from a reactive and observant life form into a sapient being. From her deep observations in the sands, she had discerned that the forest had once been much vaster in ages past. Roaming the forest edges with this knowledge, she recognized the indications and inferred that each cycle expanded the sands, encroaching upon more of the fertile terrain the plants required for their growth. She perceived that the forest's time was finite, and that the predators would grow more perilous as the space to evade them dwindled, and thus forged her plan to assail the rapidly breeding species to safeguard herself and my ancestral kind, which she still regarded as her own. It was also during this period of replenishment that her biology prompted the creation of offspring. Utterly captivated, Neil paused briefly before realizing that Naya did not plan to proceed further, prompting her to swiftly inquire, "Is this the extent of your knowledge regarding the initial one?" She has continued living beyond this stage, and I am aware of further details about her life, but I have halted my account here because you requested information solely about her experiences prior to the existence of any other beings like myself. Please tell me more. Carla's curiosity and yearning for more knowledge was profound, prompting her to request further elaboration. Naya found herself taken aback by this response, while the recollections of the primordial being held immense significance for her species. She wondered how they could be perceived as anything more than fragmented vestiges from the annals of a bygone realm for a human such as Carla. Putting herself back into a mindset to express an outside summary of her ancestor's life, she strung along more words, sending them to the translator in succession. The first one sensed the formation of an offspring within her and wandered the forest with an intense craving. In her desire to safeguard my ancestor species, she also searched for them, hoping to impart the knowledge she had acquired, and that had aided her. But whenever she encountered living individuals, they fled from her, anxious to remain concealed and to avoid drawing predators by breaking their solitude. She also came upon numerous remains. They could no longer benefit from her knowledge. When the fourth era of plenty reached its middle, she relented and ceased her quest. They refused to heed her, disregarding both her cautions and counsel. And the moment had arrived when her progeny began to shape its own musings, so she focused on imparting to it all she knew. Every insight she had gained, every lesson learned, and every experience endured. She had also made contact with the fast breeders on 3 occasions. Twice she had been pursued and forced to retreat. Subduing her alarm, she prevailed in both instances. And once she came upon a fast breeder nest, concealed amidst dense vegetation, but guarded by only a handful of them. Defying her instincts, she assailed the nest. The sentries swiftly converged upon her, but she crushed the first one by one until none remained. She then proceeded to trample the nest until no life stirred. I must add a piece of information to the explanation on the creation of offspring that I have not yet provided you. I did not mention it earlier, as it was not relevant, but it has now become pertinent. Since the process of creating offspring is highly demanding in terms of energy and mental capacity, it may impact an individual's ability to survive other energy-intensive efforts, like evading pursuit or even seeking shelter during storms. Just as the process of creating offspring is initiated by my species biology through nutrient intake and the environmental influence of the abundant season, the process may also be halted or terminated. The weight of Naya's account brought to mind for her the instances when this had befallen others of her kind. These bereavements she had not even tallied among the 713. She had also sensed a flicker of consternation from Carla and paused a moment for her to voice it, but she stayed mute. The initial offspring faced a similar plight after the nest assault left it injured and depleted. Its growth was agonizingly stalled, casting doubt on whether it would continue. However, her deep familiarity with the forest allowed her to swiftly restore her nutrient reserves, thereby averting the loss of her offspring. When it gained autonomy near the conclusion of the 4th prosperous era, she discovered it to be similarly uncommunicative as my progenitor kind. Although it possessed her wisdom and remained alongside her due to it, Her progeny did not progress beyond passive observation and reciting what she had imparted. They persisted together through the cooling phase and then reconvened following the period of immense tempests. Then the fifth plentiful cycle ended, and for the first time she constructed something distinct from the sandstorm shelter. Applying the insights gained by observing nature, she fashioned protection for her own form, and her offspring emulated her to do likewise. The armor she now bore made her movements more sluggish, but granted her a shield against the swift breeder's talons. The initial one came across 2 hunting parties of the rapid breeders. Alongside her progeny, she fended off the first. It demonstrated to her that her knowledge and construction prowess could safeguard herself and her species. The second group she encountered was larger, comprising 2 parties combined. During the struggle for survival, the first one became separated from her offspring. While she succeeded in repelling the aggressors, she failed to reunite with her progeny. Nia pondered over the recollections following that occurrence and observed how they were once more disjointed and indistinct. It felt peculiar to traverse through the first one's existence step by step, as she was doing presently, and equally odd to condense a life into the impactful moments. Had she been conversing with her kind, she would have already imparted all of these memories in their entirety. The subsequent period was once more an exceptionally turbulent one, challenging to articulate. The recollections, too, bore the sentiments of bereavement that were as profound in Nia now as they had been during that initial phase. The initial one sought her young through the lingering span of plenty and the ensuing chill. During her journeys, she had frequently intersected paths with the swift reproducers. These meetings had greatly broadened her understanding of them, allowing her to consistently evade hunting parties while discovering several additional nests. Yet she still hadn't encountered others of my ancestral kind that she could impart her knowledge and learnings to. This incapacity to convey made her conclude that the sole path to their salvation lay in eliminating the predators, and that could only be achieved through augmenting her own strength. Carla had picked that instant to interject, and astonishingly exhibited comparable sentiments when she inquired whether the initial one had reunited with her offspring. Nia was taken aback momentarily. This human lacked the recollections of the primordial one, yet how could she come to sense her anguish and desperation? I must apologize for posing a query in response, but you seem to be reflecting the sentiments that these recollections are evoking within me. I fail to comprehend how this phenomenon is feasible, as I had been under the impression that humans were incapable of perceiving the emotional state of another entity. That wasn't the most peculiar inquiry Nia had posed thus far, yet Neil was still somewhat taken aback. Indeed, she did feel compassion for this individual she had just learned of, but it was because the first one was precisely that, the inaugural member of a species. How could she not become immersed in this fantastic tale? It did raise the question of how Nia had so readily comprehended her emotional state, since she thought she had spoken in a neutral manner. No, humans are unable to directly sense the emotions of others. Typically, vocal tone and non-verbal cues allow us to gauge another person's feelings. However, this can be misleading and may even be intentionally manipulated. At present, I'm simply listening to your account and envisioning what the initial individual must have experienced, nothing further. The translator paused briefly before responding. Yet why do you experience such feelings? What I've described took place long ago, and you seem utterly unconcerned with any of those occurrences. At that moment, she grew acutely conscious of the 2 large dark eyes intently focused upon her, and the sensation of being under an intense spotlight washed over her once more. Swiftly, she stood up from the chair, seeking to gather her thoughts more clearly. Look, we humans are compassionate beings, some more so than others. Personally, I tend to put myself in the shoes of the characters in stories I hear or read about. This allows me to feel sadness alongside them, or joy if the tale takes a happier turn, especially if it's based on real events. It does mean I may get emotionally invested in a fictional character's demise within a book, but isn't that the hallmark of an engaging narrative after all? I'm a bit uncertain about your point. What made you bring up the difference between empathy for real stories and sadness over a fictional passing? Doesn't the term fictional imply that it's not factual? A realization dawned upon Neil. Nayar's race had never evolved the art of storytelling, and consequently they lacked fictional narratives. Her thoughts raced. With their seemingly flawless generational memory, there had been no necessity to transform occurrences into tales. It also explained why she had mentioned the challenges of recounting the tale of the primordial one. Her fingers were tangled in her tresses once more as she endeavored to envision an existence devoid of fictional tales. How might one elucidate such an abstract notion? Carefully she began. That's correct. If something is fictional, it means it is not true. In the context of stories and tales, however, it is not necessarily a negative thing. Humans do not possess the memories of their ancestors and must learn indirectly about events not involving them. From the tradition of retelling what had truly occurred also emerged a way to create entertainment by embellishing factual details of these past situations. And from that, humans came to develop telling completely untrue stories by outright creating fictional circumstances with characters that do not exist, encountering situations that never took place. This is also done for purposes of enjoyment and learning. Once more, Neil's gaze shifted to the other set of eyes, contemplating whether his explanation had lacked sufficient clarity. They fabricated tales about previous occurrences, and likewise crafted fictional situations purely for amusement's sake. Yet if their capacity for expression was constrained by the language they employed to interact, there would be no means to discern the truth. Nayar had deduced that humans lacked the ability to fully impart memories across individuals. This newfound knowledge led her to perceive it as an even greater hindrance. Piecing the words together to convey them to the translator, she pondered, if one solely acquires knowledge of others' experiences through language, does that not result in missing a substantial portion of that memory? Moreover, if one's understanding of the past relies on recountings, how can the veracity of that past be verified? Regrettably, Kyla embarked on yet another lengthy elucidation, employing terminology pertaining to technology and machinery that eluded Nayar's comprehension. However, she did discern from this discourse that humans had devised techniques to externally preserve records of occurrences and to verify the veracity of narratives concerning the past, a practice they seemingly engaged in frequently. I apologize, I could not entirely comprehend your explanation as you utilized terminology unfamiliar to me. The notion of verifying the accuracy of information regarding past occurrences is foreign to my kind, and I cannot grasp how it influences the capacity for interpersonal communication among your species. It took a moment before Kyla, who inexplicably emanated discomfort, offered another explanation. She informed Nayar about what humans termed lying, which involved the purposeful and deliberate telling of untruths, and she elucidated that it could be employed maliciously to falsely depict a situation to other humans for selfish gain. However, she also asserted that this occurred infrequently, and lying was actually most commonly utilized in daily superficial communication to modify presented information in order to mitigate the emotional distress another human might experience from the truth. No, this still failed to make complete sense. Thus, lying was something humans engaged in with malicious intent, kindly motives for amusement's sake, and evidently, quite frequently. A query did assert itself at the forefront of Nayar's thoughts, and she swiftly formulated it to voice it. Have you been untruthful during this gathering? Carlos responded with a frank earnestness that she had not, and further affirmed that she would never seek to mislead Nayar. Nayar proceeded with the rational subsequent inquiry. Could you kindly relate to me an untruthful occurrence so that I might encounter a falsehood? As Kyla started describing the kind of meal she'd had prior to the recent break, Nayar quickly realized that whatever she was saying wasn't truthful. Kyla's demeanor had shifted, and her emotional state seemed superficial and clearly contrived. You are not telling the truth. It wasn't a query. Neil struggled to grasp Nayar's eagerness to witness a human engaging in deception, and now she had offered what appeared to be her analytical assessment of an utterance deliberately crafted to be false. This carried an air of a dare for Neil, despite her being a dreadful prevaricator. All right then. To give you a sense of how a human might engage in this kind of exchange, let me share something that could be true or untrue. You can then let me know your thoughts on it. Nayar stirred a bit, yet stayed quiet. So after a brief pause to gather his thoughts, Neil started. Back home, there's this little lake. One day, around 20 of us, myself included, had gathered there with the intention of having a bonfire. The idea was... Neil was unable to reach the heart of the narrative before the interpreter cut her off, uttering, "The account you're providing lacks veracity." And she was perplexed. That could hardly have been apparent, as she had scarcely prepared it. Moreover, Neil was fairly certain that whatever she might convey from happenings on Earth would likely be enigmatic gibberish for Nayar in any case. All right, another tale then. One day I ventured out to a playground with my nephew, and he found himself stuck atop the monkey bars. Quite lofty ones, old-fashioned style. Now it so happened that this was a day when I had attended a formal affair, so I was attired in nice garments and dress shoes, but I had to retrieve him down nonetheless. Thus, I attempted to ascend to him, and right before I reached the summit, my feet lost traction, I lost my grip, and I plummeted all the way back down. As if to illustrate, Neil caressed her right arm while carrying on. The entire right sleeve of my shirt tore off because the cuff somehow got caught, and I believe I very nearly fractured my tailbone. While I was writhing on the ground in agony, my nephew mysteriously materialized right next to me, attempting to comfort me. I may not fully grasp the specifics of the circumstance you've outlined, but I recognize that you're recounting an authentic occurrence from your personal history. Could Nayar somehow detect falsehoods? How might she have perceived that the tale Neil enjoyed sharing in casual settings was in fact a genuine account? You are correct, that was a true story. How are you doing this? I notice a change in you when you try to recount something that didn't actually occur. Neil brought her palms together, interrupting diplomacy briefly to probe the boundaries of this faculty. She understood that being adept at either deceiving convincingly or discerning deception in others was a skill, so there was simply no feasible way for a being from another species to innately distinguish truth from falsehood. So you can tell when I fabricate a story? It appears so. If I were to inform you that I've merely had 6 hours of slumber over the past 36 hours, would that statement be factual? Yes. 2 weeks prior, I celebrated my 25th birthday. Nothing particularly remarkable about that, is there? The initial portion of your statement is indeed truthful. However, I find myself unable to place this information within a meaningful context. What of the reality that my patriarch's appellation is Grombloncus Tartuncle III? One can discern the veracity therein. It is certainly accurate. However, I find myself perplexed. Does the information you're imparting to me hold any significance? I struggle to comprehend the rationale behind your decision to divulge these personal particulars about yourself. Forgive me, it's just... Neil stretched her arms and then rested her hands atop her head. It's absolutely captivating. Typically, humans cannot discern if another is being untruthful, barring instances where the falsehood is unconvincing. Conversely, the truth could be so peculiar that others may deem it fiction. You even lack the framework of human experience to properly contextualize it. Yet it had proven quite simple to discern whether Carla spoke falsely. Perhaps humans focused more intently on the fundamental expression of words and were thus more readily misled. For Nayar, the inquiry persisted as to how this could ever be considered amusing. I'm not assessing the truthfulness of your claims based on the information provided, so I don't need to contrast it with prior knowledge. However, I'm quite taken aback by your revelation, since you did state that crafting imaginary occurrences with fictional personas was for amusement, and I cannot discern how this could be feasible. This was evidently a very ancient human tradition, as Carla stated that the origins of storytelling came from the far distant past, when humans had little else but information conveyed through spoken language. Occurrences of interest or experiences that had an instructive effect were fashioned into stories that were shared among all humans, but especially recounted to children. She noted that the aim was to capture their attention or to heighten the learning effect, so those tales were eventually altered, simplified, or made more intricate, or simply embellished to accentuate the valuable elements. The children eventually matured to relate the same stories to their own offspring, and after numerous retellings, these narratives would then become unrecognizable. Thus they were fictional, even if they had been grounded in a true account at some juncture. Acquiring knowledge through falsehood seemed an odd notion. Why wouldn't they simply recount the closest approximation to the actual recollection they wished to impart? Wouldn't that serve as the most compelling evidence of significance, an event of note that had truly transpired and could potentially recur? I fail to grasp the merit in recounting an occurrence in an untruthful manner. Would it not lead the young ones to lose faith in the elders once they discover that the tales imparted to them were mere fiction? Amusement, tinged with a hint of guilt, arose within Carla as she responded that while children's tales might foster some distrust, they remained crucial nonetheless. If the revelation was handled properly by adult humans, children could even glean valuable lessons from realizing the stories were fictional and understanding the rationale behind them. So did these untruths cease at a certain juncture? For her, it still contradicted the essence of understanding if it stemmed from an occurrence that had never transpired. Based on your explanation, I recognize that systems are essential to accelerate the learning process for your young ones. Additionally, I comprehend that the importance of storytelling is remarkable for their development, and I would be delighted to receive illustrations of such narratives. Carla promptly proposed to happily share parts or even the entirety of their expansive anthology of tales for young ones. She then bluntly remarked that grown-ups too relished fictional narratives and even had a particular variety of it that was inappropriate for children, leaving Nayar once again perplexed. Do grown adults still require fictional tales to gain wisdom from history? Yes, she could certainly detect that sense of puzzlement in the voice emanating from the translator. Or perhaps her ears simply endeavored to imbue more humanness to Nayar the further she delved into understanding her. No, it's not quite like that. There are many historical occurrences that did get recounted in a slightly altered manner due to their importance. However, a significant number of tales for adults and children alike are not merely untrue, but implausible. It's more akin to a hypothetical scenario, and that can be situated in the past, or in an authentic location, or embedded within a genuine event. It may incorporate real individuals, or it could draw inspiration from real experiences. It could even be set in the conceivable yet imaginative future. There are no boundaries. That's the captivating essence of it. We can listen to or narrate tales that could never transpire, yet still glean insights from them. It's a means to evoke wonder, cultivate empathy, and witness characters undergo experiences that then compel us to ponder and contemplate. Neil failed to perceive that Nayar had gradually brought her head in close proximity to the transparent partition. Until the translator vocalized, "Have you ever conceived an imaginary situation involving an encounter with a sentient species not native to Earth?" That query regarding fiction about alien encounters left Neil momentarily stumped. How could she possibly respond to that? There were likely millions of different media works on the subject. And they spanned a vast array of themes, genres, and alien portrayals. Collectively, humans had envisioned all manner of encounters with extraterrestrials. Some she greatly preferred not to dwell upon. Nonetheless, it was such a widely enjoyed topic that there were even alien tales crafted specifically for young audiences, though perhaps it was advisable not to delve too deeply into all of this. This is an intriguing subject matter for our consideration. Indeed, there exist numerous fictional narratives depicting encounters with intelligent beings apart from humankind. I would like to receive examples of those narratives, along with additional narratives intended for mature audiences. Well, let me see, Neil gestured. There's quite a variety. However, I don't believe it would be wise to simply provide you with the entire collection of human works if you've never encountered fictional tales before. Would it be all right if I curated a limited selection for you instead? To Carla's astonishment, Nia repeated the nodding gesture as the translator conveyed, "This arrangement is satisfactory. I have faith in your choice of candidates." Neil hadn't anticipated this situation. Naturally, there was an assortment of exemplary human artworks she could present as gifts, but she suspected sci-fi pieces depicting initial alien encounters were scarcely, if at all, included among them. "I'm presuming your species doesn't have a comparable practice of crafting and exchanging fictional tales." However, she moved to the opposite side of the chair, where the waist-high cube stood that Nia had formed shortly before Neil had nearly caused her to depart by disclosing the human population figure. "You possess other artistic mediums, correct? Like this cube, it's a marvelous sculpture. For a human, fashioning such a precise geometric shape manually would signify immense skill and artistry." Nia's gaze had turned from her to the cube and then back again. "It is an empty form without purpose, and it's not hard to craft since there's no inner design and role. And I've perceived art to signify handmade creations, but you've already clarified that machines have assumed the duty of construction. Well, art encompasses more than just that. But fundamentally, something qualifies as art when it appeals to one or more human senses, evokes an emotional response, and provides a form of entertainment. It need not serve a practical purpose. In fact, most artistic works lack utility. So in my view, the sculpture you've crafted aligns with that definition." After a prolonged pause, the translator voiced another query. "Would you consider the fictional tales you create to be artistic works?" The sensation of eager concurrence came even prior to Carla's affirmative response. She proceeded to elucidate that narratives were one artistic expression among numerous others, and that human beings had engaged in the creation of art since the dawn of their existence. Something appealing to the senses, Nia could comprehend why humans would prioritize this when crafting devices and machinery, as her own kind engaged in similar practices. However, constructing something solely for aesthetic purposes without any practical application seemed perplexing to her. Why expend the effort or resources on such an endeavor? She relayed the words to the translator. "I wish to observe how you craft such a sculpture, as I had the notion that you were unable to fashion objects in the manner my species can." But Carla explained that such sculptures were fashioned from metal, stone, or organic materials that were then either assembled or reshaped into the desired form. She also apologized, pointing out that even had she brought the necessary supplies, she would be unable to create anything meaningful due to lacking the artistic talent. As she spoke, an excited eagerness grew within her. This culminated in Carla telling Nia that she would bring even more objects to showcase before she abruptly turned and hurried back to her spacecraft. During her absence, Nia turned her gaze towards the cube she had fashioned. It appeared utterly unremarkable, and she could not comprehend how Carla might find anything positive to remark about it. In stark contrast, the flat metallic piece she had brought as an offering and left resting upon the chair was truly impressive. It exhibited an extremely narrow deviation in its measurements, particularly in the depth and thickness of the linework, and also possessed the capability to store information. Those devices the humans possessed seemed quite intriguing. Nia contemplated requesting a demonstration of the weaving apparatus, as that one would be nearby at least. Her thoughts remained unfinished, however, as Carla was already making her way back. In her grasp, she held two objects that would likely be considered artworks, yet they were notably distinct from one another. One was a slender rectangular item, potentially crafted from an organic substance, its length and width approximating the breadth of Carla's torso. The other piece was a roughly cone-shaped formation of colored stone. The intent behind the first item became evident when Carla placed it on the chair, unveiling a portrayal of a portion of a humanoid figure on its reverse side. Although it was likely a human representation, the hues and dimensions differed considerably from Carla's own. Ere Nia could voice an inquiry, Carla had commenced discoursing about the item she still grasped in her palms. She elucidated that, akin to the cube, It was a hollow form and handcrafted. Naya could not allow her to complete her words, for this was beyond comprehension. This hollow stone structure was remarkably close to being perfectly symmetrical, a feat that was infamously challenging to achieve. At this juncture, she had accepted that the humans were incapable of constructing anything on their own. And now Carla presented this remarkable artifact. She quickly put together the question, "How did you build it?" The words simply poured out of Neil. The fundamental material is clay, and the items crafted from it are termed pottery. An individual who creates pottery is known as a potter, and they fashion a vase by placing a lump of clay onto a spinning wheel. This is then meticulously shaped by the potter with their moistened hands into the desired form. To transform it into pottery, the clay must then be hardened, a process achieved by firing it in an oven at scorching temperatures. Prior to the firing, the unfired pottery is typically coated with a solution of metallic compounds that bind to the clay during the burning, forming a protective layer that renders the finished pottery waterproof and imparts it with color. And just to indicate that she had indeed elucidated it too rapidly and inadequately, Nia gazed wordlessly for nearly a minute, before the translator simply inquired, "You constructed this by rotating and warming soil?" This caused her to hesitate briefly, as she inadvertently and gradually brought down the vase that she had been holding aloft with both hands. "It wasn't my doing. Another individual crafted it. And it's a particular variety of soil with a specific composition. But yes, I suppose that's essentially what transpired." "What purpose does it serve?" "It's a vase for—" she started, before realizing that Naya's species might not have utilized such objects. "There is a human custom of gathering certain plants, usually vibrant ones, and offering them as gifts to others. Since these are severed from their roots or plucked from the ground, these vases are filled with water to sustain them when they are then inserted through the top opening. The narrow aperture would also support the plants while upright, and the large cavity weighted down by water prevents the vase from easily toppling over." If I'm not mistaken, the practice of presenting a plant as a gift is merely a social custom without any deeper significance. And around this non-essential act, you have introduced the additional step of using a specially designed vessel to extend the finite lifespan of those gifted plants. I fail to recognize this as a compelling justification for humans to have devised and refined an entire manufacturing process. That did come across a tad harsh, while it was accurate that vases served primarily as decorative pieces and containers for plants, the latter itself not having much practical use. Naya appeared to hold the notion that pottery encompassed solely vases. In ancient times, pottery emerged as the earliest method for humans to construct durable objects from the earth itself. The initial creations were vessels for storing food, but the hardened clay could be molded into various forms, such as cups and dishes. Vases represent a particular category of pottery, and I believe their origins trace back to vials, which were utilized for containing drinking water and other liquids. Then the vial appears to serve a more vital function, as its role is to contain sustenance, despite the vase's exquisite form. Do you have handcrafted vials aboard your vessel for storing water as well? Neil shook her head and motioned with a free hand while explaining, "Most pottery was supplanted by more durable glass, metal, and later polymer products derived from hydrocarbons. Actual stoneware is scarcely utilized anymore. So no, I did not bring any vials aboard my ship, as we now have far superior methods to contain liquids, which also do not involve any handcrafted components." Nia appeared to undergo another contemplative moment, her substantial form moving wordlessly, yet the translator maintained an unbroken silence. "Would you like me to describe the other artistic piece I've brought along? It's a replica of a renowned painting," Neil delicately proposed, gesturing toward the chair. "I've already discerned the depiction to be of a human head, based on the resemblances to your physique and the images on the knowledge cache plaque. Though the surface texture is uneven, and I surmise that you fashioned this depiction by thinly applying a viscous colored material onto a flat surface, which then solidified into a layer that cracked during the drying process." Her digits tapped rhythmically upon the vase as Neil abruptly spoke. "To what extent are you capable of—" "What was the reason behind crafting it in that manner?" The translator's voice cut across her inquiry. "I didn't," she responded slowly, before composing herself and inquiring, "Nayar, how clearly can you perceive? Are you truly able to make out the textural details of the painting from your current position?" For her own contemplation, Neil allowed her gaze to traverse the expanse separating the chair from the transparent partition, likely spanning a touch more than 3 full strides. Nayar's large obsidian eyes, she estimated, lay another 2 paces beyond. Yes. At last she placed the vase down and utilized her now free hands to run through the hair at the nape of her neck. A hint of frustration resurfaced, though Neil couldn't discern if it stemmed from the subject matter, Nayar's miscomprehensions, or the gradual mental exhaustion creeping up on her. Settling back into the chair, she gently moved the plaque aside and positioned the picture to face Nayar, leaning it against the cube. This portrays a replica of the renowned painting titled Girl with a Pearl Earring. More precisely, it's a sprayed reproduction, the term used for a replication of a painting crafted by matter printers, capturing the intricate structural details. It is said that this technique faithfully encapsulates the essence of the original brushstrokes. Based on your contemplative observations, I am compelled to concur with this assertion. This reproduction was even printed onto authentic canvas and then fitted within a wooden frame so it would appear as close as feasible to the original, which is presumably still displayed in some museum on Earth. Accompanying it are thousands of other artworks. Some depict individuals, some portray distinct scenes of historically momentous events, and others capture mundane, everyday moments and objects. They are all deemed significant to humans because they represent tiny fragments of our past, an intricate and remarkably crafted replica of an item that seemingly had the sole purpose of depicting the semblance of a human female from a bygone era. Nayar could fathom the rationale behind the creation of the original artwork. If humans lacked the capacity for flawless recollection of memories, and by extension the appearance of their fellow beings, this would serve as a means to preserve the image of one who had passed away. While it appeared a rather constrained approach, why not simply construct a human figure and then paint upon that? They even possessed that malleable clay substance, which could seemingly be hand-molded with ease and subsequently hardened. Why would they introduce that level of abstraction and then recreate the semblance of a human onto a 2-dimensional plane, omitting so many intricacies? She did not see how she would even commence translating Kyla's appearance into 2 dimensions, even if she did know precisely what she resembled and could readily craft a shape that would replicate her flawlessly. She could likely generate an outline form akin to the human depictions on the plaque, but then fill it in with the requisite details to forge a semblance of her without any depth. Nayar's mind grappled with her attempts to summon the image. She also got preoccupied with the painting process. Applying colored pigments onto any surface in a deliberately precise manner seemed nearly impossible. The surface texture suggested that instead of fingers, some kind of multi-tipped tool must have been used by its creator. Was that the secret to achieving precision? Yet even then, compared to the intricate patterns and softly blended hues of Kyla's skin, the human figure in this painting appeared almost featureless. Did the artist behind the painting simply leave out all the intricacies they couldn't capture on the canvas? Were these visual depictions similarly lacking in precision as the oral recountings from times past that Kyla had discussed? Did the woman portrayed in the painting look vastly dissimilar, the artwork being merely an interpretation based on her true likeness? Nayar attempted to center her attention on a solitary aspect of Kyla's visage, endeavoring to emulate a comparable approach. She focused her efforts on simplifying her eyes into merely their overall form and hues. This was not the inaugural instance she had scrutinized them intently, and once more she was struck by the intricacy of the human's visual sensory apparatus. She swiftly pulled her focus back and began anew to reduce the visual intricacies of the eyes, lowering the apparent precision needed to paint them. She failed to conjure a mental image that could be translated into painting along the same process. yet still retained the semblance of Carla's eyes. So Niar went through another iteration, and another, and then a couple more, these times abandoning any attempts to stay analogous to the painting. Time and again she frustratingly could not replicate, for that single facial feature, what the creator of the painting had accomplished for a complete head, to capture the human form within the constraints of 2 dimensions, and that was even if she did allow herself to disregard the limitations of the creative process. Her frame, warmed by the mental exertion, trembled with the onset of fatigue. It had been a considerable while since she'd undertaken a comparably arduous task, and this had now drained far more of her vigor and taken a heavier toll than she'd expected. Yet she could not quite let the matter rest. Gazing at just the eye in the painting, how did it manage to capture the essential look while lacking so much else? She unmistakably recognized the human face and, independently, the eyes as well, even if they differed from Carla's. But Niar could not mentally pinpoint the precise moment when just enough complexity and depth was stripped away to create a 2-dimensional depiction of even just an eye that would still bear resemblance to the original. How might she convey and yet preserve the aspect of that completely lightless black expanse behind the lens of the pupil, the form of the colored ring encircling that lens that bore such resemblance to the remnants of an exploded star, the added dimension from the clear dome above the center of the eye that was only perceptible through the glimmer of reflected illumination? She longed to recreate the radiance of the white, multi-layered surface of the eyeball, where delicate red lines branched inward toward the center of the eye, growing ever finer until they disappeared from sight, and she would preserve the sheen imparted by the thin yet unbroken liquid film, which enabled her to glimpse her own reflection mirrored in Carla's eye. It was only after gradually emerging from her deep contemplation that she became aware of Carla's increasingly concerned and slightly panicked calls directed at her. Niar had, rather embarrassingly, been unresponsive for several minutes, prompting her to swiftly formulate a suitable apology and transmit it through the translator. "I must apologize for my lack of attentiveness and failure to respond to your words. There is no cause for concern. I am quite well. I was simply absorbed in contemplating the abstract process required to create a painting, devoting my full concentration to it. Regrettably, I was unable to replicate this process." Carla was momentarily puzzled as she inquired whether Niar had discreetly tried her hand at creating a painting without drawing Carla's attention to it. "Yes, I have envisioned painting a portrait of your eyes, employing a process akin to the one used for this artwork. However, I would rather shift our discussion away from this artistic endeavor, as I am keen to explore further, though I do not wish to dedicate more thought to it presently." Quick flickers of several different emotions were barely perceptible before Carla settled into a forced, neutral demeanor. She then elaborated that there were numerous other forms of art, and that she had chosen these 2 objects to present, as she had presumed they would be the most straightforward ones for Niar to comprehend. She appended an apology for her mistaken assumption before proposing to discuss music, which was an art form that was as deeply ingrained in human history and traditions as storytelling, while being akin to it. Without pausing to await further details, Niar impulsively voiced the inquiry. "You have no novel items to present to me?" Tinged with the delight of a revelation, the response was in the negative. Carla mentioned that a human voice would be adequate for a demonstration, which she volunteered to provide. Simultaneously, she apologized beforehand that the only music she could reproduce would not be truly emblematic of the art form in its entirety. Niar's form had not fully regained its tranquil state, yet this appeared to be a less demanding subject matter. She had already discerned how the humans conveyed information through their vocal expressions, which exhibited a logical framework and discernible patterns. She surmised that this had to be something analogous, if not entirely identical. "Kindly go ahead with a musical performance," she conveyed to the interpreter. Yet she found herself utterly unprepared for the events that unfolded thereafter. A surge of intense emotions emanated from Carla, akin to the profound and overwhelming sensations she had experienced when she first uttered the word "mother." This wave of feeling nearly overwhelmed Nayar's own thoughts, compelling her to instinctively mirror Carla's emotional state. A pleasant warmth had now taken hold of her, and she felt deep admiration and cherish for an individual about whom she knew nothing beyond these feelings Carla harbored towards them. Along with that came shades of subtle positive sentiments that spoke of the importance of this relationship. She was clearly associating with the words she uttered. There also existed such a strong desire for protection and care that it left Nayar in a state where she was torn between what her body actually conveyed and the easily believable imagination that she carried a dependent offspring, which caused her to feel these emotions. The remainder of her focus was directed towards comprehending the utterances, most of which she could not recognize. Kyla was conversing in a manner that differed greatly from her previous speech patterns. Complementing this new mode of expression, she modulated her vocal tones to accurately generate and recreate sequences of frequencies that exhibited a perceptible mathematical pattern. Through the melodious cadence of her voice alone, Carla wove a spellbinding tapestry of words that, intertwined with the depth of her feelings, utterly captivated Nayar throughout the entire demonstration, leaving her slightly entranced even after its conclusion. "What was that?" The translator hadn't utilized the resonant, powerful voice, instead emitting a sound more akin to the aged device Nayar had previously employed. Accompanied by this momentary lull, it rekindled a slight sense of unease within Neil. Perhaps she had committed some misstep. With a hint of reluctance, she elucidated, "That melody was titled Aroro mi Niño. It's a lullaby, a form of music crafted to calm young ones. It's not particularly renowned and quite antiquated, but it's the sole piece I've been rehearsing." "Is this how you communicate emotion to your offspring?" The voice seemed to return to its usual tone, yet Carla remained puzzled by the inquiry itself. She settled back into her seat, contemplating how to respond. "In a sense, yes. I mean, a lullaby typically consists of soothing words and is intended to be sung softly, inducing a state of tranquility and serenity. At the very least, it has always had that effect on my nephew." Reclining in her seat and resting her hands behind her neck, she continued, "Lullabies, I believe, are among the most ancient musical forms. Soothing children must have been a necessity since the dawn of humanity. My kind has a comparable process to induce a tranquil condition, with melodious tones that could likewise be employed on dependent young. The exact makeup of the sounds is distinct to individuals, as it cannot be replicated with precision. I am uncertain if I can suitably exhibit this capability to you, but I would nonetheless propose to attempt." This had taken an unanticipated direction. Did Nayar's kind truly vocalize as well? Naturally, it would differ from a formal melody, as they lacked an actual language, but humming and whistling were also forms of music, were they not? "I would be most delighted to hear your rendition of a lullaby. Kindly, share with me your interpretation of such a soothing melody." For a prolonged moment, nothing transpired. Then a soft yet profound hum began emanating from an indistinct location. It possessed a gradually evolving tone and was remarkably challenging to focus upon, so Neil closed her eyes and strained her ears. Deeper and higher pitches slowly joined in, carrying their own seemingly erratic pattern that harmonized with the previous ones. After a while, they had become numerous enough to transform into a complex acoustic experience. Still, the entire ensemble remained very deep in tone, right around the lower edge of her hearing range. For a while, she listened intently to the piece, appreciating the tonal patterns that she would undoubtedly classify as music, despite its seeming to be a rather slow composition. She anticipated the demonstration to conclude at any moment, but promptly closed her eyes once more as gentle pings around the middle register joined the deep hums. These additions blended flawlessly with the subtle high points of the underlying random harmony, providing her mind and ears a slow and steady rhythm to concentrate on. The melodious high notes, delicately weaving bright accents into the tune, were the final memory Neil held before drifting into slumber. Blinking a few times, Neil felt disoriented and puzzled. Though it was dark and quiet, She was undoubtedly still seated in the chair aboard Nayar's vessel, having just awakened. A blend of embarrassment and self-directed frustration caused a flush of warmth to rise in her cheeks as the realization dawned. Neil seemed to have dozed off while Nayar was demonstrating her singing talent. With her even turning off the lights, it was evident she had taken note of it. For an ambassador to simply drift into slumber during a meeting was remarkably unprofessional. Suppressing her voice, Neil called out into the gloom, "Hello, Nayar, are you still present?" The illumination within the chamber gradually increased from complete blackness, returning to the cozy level of brightness it had previously, unveiling the massive alien cranium behind the transparent partition that, as Neil envisioned, exhibited a rather critical countenance through both sets of its obsidian eyes. Even before she could fully shift into diplomatic mode, the translator interjected, "Once more, I must apologize for my lack of attentiveness to your presence. The mechanism that my species utilizes to induce a tranquil mental state in offspring is employed by mature individuals for the same purpose. I found myself unable to avoid entering a meditative state, only regaining full awareness after 37 minutes had passed. To my surprise, upon emerging, I discovered you were also in a state of meditation. If my assumption is accurate, that I was the catalyst for this occurrence, please accept my sincere apologies once more." Fortunately, the initial surge of adrenaline and now her perplexity after this unexpected turn of events completely dispelled any lingering fatigue from her mind. Fueled by this newfound vigor, she sprang up from the chair and paced a few steps along the expansive window to gather her thoughts. If her understanding was correct, Nayar had essentially drifted off into slumber as well. "There's no need to apologize, you did give me a heads up. As for my part," she paused as warmth crept into her cheeks again, "that wasn't really on you. I miscalculated and, I suppose, also disregarded my present need for rest and ended up dozing off. That was improper conduct on my part, and I truly regret it. It appears we've reached a stage of weariness without addressing the evident necessity for proper rest. This meeting, along with the remarkable knowledge I'm acquiring, has also continuously exerted a significant and unforeseen toll on my physical and mental state. If you require a break to resume your meditation or to return to your vessel, I would gladly oblige." "That's very considerate of you, although I'll certainly need to sleep in a bed if I want to get proper rest," Neil remarked as she rubbed the back of her head. "And just to clarify, I didn't meditate. I was actually fully asleep." Nayar deliberately turned her head and paused before responding, causing Neil's somewhat fatigued mind to revisit her previous statements and consider if she had inadvertently misspoken or strayed too far from diplomatic phrasing. Doesn't meditation depict the condition of mental rejuvenation via self-directed sensory detachment? And isn't sleeping a mode of biological dormancy? A brief pause ensued before she fully grasped the inquiry and could respond, "Yes, you're right, Yet you stressed the point that you had been slumbering beforehand. It wasn't an ideal time to attempt comprehending the thought process of a 10-ton immortal alien entity." Nevertheless, Neil persisted and strived to recollect the information she had received regarding the non-sentient species inhabiting exoplanets with ecosystems. Notably, evolution on only one other planet had yielded creatures exhibiting a distinct sleep-wake cycle akin to a rhythm. Nearly every species on Earth has its biological functions intimately linked to the cycle of day and night. A key aspect of this is a pattern of alternating activity and repose. During that period of repose, energy is preserved by remaining stationary and also minimizing mental exertion. For humans and other species as well, this state is what we refer to as sleep. That had been a blend of what she could recollect from the textbooks and a rather chaotic situation. So she swiftly proceeded. "For the moment, let's focus on humans. Biologically, we are structured to be active during the daytime, with our eyes functioning optimally in those light conditions. For enhanced efficiency, certain biological processes are slowed or even temporarily halted during that period. While these periods of wakefulness are vital for our well-being, after a day filled with high levels of activity, we experience a progressively stronger urge for sleep. We describe this as feeling tired, but it extends beyond mere mental or physical exhaustion, as it can occur even if we don't actively engage in any tasks throughout the day. Sleep is typically initiated voluntarily, but it can also overpower us if the state of heightened activity persists for too long or if our previous sleep periods were inadequate. In a manner that seemed almost effortless, she managed to suppress the recollection of that very occurrence and proceeded onward with scarcely a momentary interruption. In that period of repose, we lack consciousness and have minimal perception of our environs. It's indeed precarious due to that very factor, and historically humans dwelled in collectives partially to safeguard one another during slumber by alternating their sleep cycles. Meditation is an intentional mental condition we can induce to unwind or replenish ourselves. The key difference from sleep lies in its biological imperative. Although some individuals practice meditation routinely, not everyone does so. In contrast, if a person goes without sleep for an extended period, it can prove fatal. Neil experienced the abrupt low-frequency vibration once more, which would have caused her to instinctively recoil had she not already taken a startled step backward in response to Nayar's unexpectedly swift motion as she pressed against the glass while simultaneously elevating herself, rendering Neil keenly conscious of her immense stature. The interpreter raised their voice, speaking rapidly and somewhat haphazardly. "Do you find yourself in a perilous situation, at risk of losing your life?" A surge of anxiety emanated from Carla, akin to Nayar's reaction upon learning that humans would perish without proper rest. She had never envisioned Carla facing peril aboard her vessel, having meticulously recreated the ideal conditions for humans, down to the precise strength of the gravitational field. It was only when Carla hurriedly assured that she was perfectly all right, merely fatigued, that Nayar's tension eased somewhat. Carla proceeded to elucidate that lack of sleep could prove fatal only after more than 5 consecutive days without slumber, and humans would exhibit severe and conspicuous adverse mental effects well before reaching that point. "I was quite concerned for your well-being upon getting this information, as you had neglected to mention your need for rest in readying for this gathering. In my kind, there exists no biological requirement for dormancy in such compressed timeframes. I would be interested to learn which biological functions occur during sleep periods." While it appeared that Nayar wouldn't receive a comprehensive response to her inquiry, as Carla excused herself for not being fully versed in the intricate processes involved. However, she did mention that certain biochemical functions within the brain played a crucial role in the processes of memorization and learning. Nevertheless, there were still a few unfamiliar terms and seemingly nonsensical phrases present in the explanation. Strangest among those were the references to short-term and long-term memory. Thus, Nayar formulated the pertinent inquiry. "I could not comprehend your elucidation as you have cited several terms that hold no significance for me. Might you kindly expound, particularly on the nexus between memory and temporal duration?" Nayar observed that Carla maintained an outwardly impassive demeanor throughout her explanation. To her disappointment, however, there were only further perplexing statements and seemingly unconnected fragments of information concerning the human brain. For Nayar, it raised more queries than it resolved, particularly the portions about recollections seemingly shifting, and also the brain comprising components. She could merely attribute it to her struggle to fully comprehend the human tongue in biological matters, but she still yearned for elucidation, as this seemed an erroneous deduction. "Is your physical brain not a unit?" Yet after that, Carla went on to say that humans possess the cognitive capabilities of 2 other non-sentient species in addition to their own. Nayar was left too astonished to grasp anything further following that revelation. "You have 3 brains?" Neil blinked silently in astonishment after being cut off by that inquiry. Had his explanation been that poor, or was her fatigue now too overwhelming, causing her to speak incoherently? "That's not the case," she responded. briefly waving her hands in vague motions. Nayar stayed quiet and, as she envisioned, anticipating a fitting clarification. Neil glanced at the chair but swiftly dismissed the notion of taking a seat, as she still harbored some lingering resentment towards it. Thus she continued standing, inhaled deeply, and endeavored to somewhat straighten things out. The human brain functions as an integrated whole. It is simply constructed upon similar brain structures found in other Earth species that share common evolutionary roots with our ancestors. Referring to these components as the primate brain, lizard brain, and mouse brain is merely for comparative purposes. This essentially implies that we can retrace the brain's evolutionary progression through our ancestral lineage, as there are discernibly distinct architectures layered upon one another, which can be linked to various developmental phases observed in other creatures. However, I'm uncertain if I'm accurately conveying this concept. The details she had offered stemmed from what she could recollect learning about biology in a previous course. Studying the brain in depth had not been a focal point for her. How convenient would it be to simply have the capacity to recall every piece of information she had ever read or heard? The architecture of your brain is truly captivating, and I can assert with confidence that my kind has not encountered beings that would parallel it. How does the signal prioritization and self-regulation across those strata operate if they are structurally segregated? Neil's fingers were already intertwined, but at that moment she noticed her fidgeting. How could one feel restless yet weary simultaneously? She placed her hands atop her head and paced a few steps along the transparent barrier to get her circulation going. However, it did little to clarify what Nayar had truly wished to understand. "I apologize, but I'm having trouble comprehending your inquiry. Would you be able to rephrase or clarify what information you're seeking?" Despite the minuscule shift, the dark eyes unmistakably tracked her leisurely steps. For reasons unclear, Neil abruptly realized that the adjacent chamber's floor lay significantly lower. A realization dawned upon her that, being at minimum 10 meters beneath her current position, she was essentially peering through a fourth-floor aperture. This caused Nayar to seem absurdly large once more. Her stature appeared relative to how aware Neil was of it, and there were instances where she had almost forgotten that she conversed with a being 10 times her size. From atop the white cube, the translator's voice resonated through the entire room as it spoke in a suitably resounding tone. "I inquire about the mechanism by which you concentrate the scattering signal cascade on the mental activity most pertinent to the present moment, while filtering out diverging branches and fractal pathways across your different layers. I also wish to know if maintaining distinct architecture types necessitates the preservation of individual process direction orbits in each layer." "Pardon," was the only thing that escaped her lips as she struggled to comprehend what appeared to be a convoluted string of words. Her reaction must have been sufficiently evident, for Nayar did not linger for further response. "I struggle to articulate my thoughts and realize I have not expressed them coherently in my prior effort." After a pause, the translator proceeded, "I wish to gain deeper insight into the evolutionary processes that shaped the human brain's emergence." Could she at least answer that confidently? Neil wasn't too certain about anything at the moment, and perhaps it was an opportune time to initiate that break, particularly because she observed that her own craving for knowledge had been largely obscured by a thick haze of mental exhaustion. She was fairly confident that under normal circumstances she would be absolutely eager to learn about the physiology of Nayar's brain. With a deep breath, she composed herself and responded, "I would be grateful to accept your kind offer and retire for an extended respite aboard my vessel." The white pressure suit's chest piece settled onto the console with its slight weight, making scarcely a sound. Ambassador Neil lowered herself into the swivel chair with a more substantial impact, then remained motionless for 30 seconds. Somehow she managed to gather enough focus to connect the cable from the console to the sole port on the chest piece. Though she did inwardly grumble about the strict no-emission protocol that all her gear had to follow due to this first contact encounter, utilizing physical connector cables felt like a relic from ages past. The console's right screen displayed the data transfer in progress, while the left one illuminated to reveal an anonymized approximation of her contact's face after she pressed the relevant buttons. "Hello, Ambassador Neil. I hope you are well." "Yeah, I believe so. Here are some additional materials for examination. See if you're able to find satisfactory responses to the inquiries I had previously left unanswered." "Okay, what is the current status?" She started, then paused. Making another try, she said, "It's all right. Niar is receptive to inquiries and keen to gain knowledge about us, so I'd keep the score at 8. However, I did doze off around half an hour ago when our discussion centered on music." Unusually, a short pause followed. I had firmly recommended taking a rest during the previous break. "How much time remains at your disposal currently?" "I asked for 6 hours. It's fine. I'll go and sleep for 5. "I suggest utilizing an approved sleeping aid." "Yeah, thanks. I'm off then." Upon receiving the response, she touched the screen, ending the call. The final report would certainly be quite remarkable. Regrettably, her unintended slumber would undoubtedly find its way into the records. Dismissing that notion, she rose and staggered out of the confined communications chamber, heading straight through the neighboring central commons space toward the automatic door at the far end, which slid open to unveil the most rudimentary sleeping quarters imaginable. In her present condition, the cramped chamber, with scarcely any furnishings apart from the plain bunk, appeared as welcoming as the finest hotel rooms she had occupied. With mechanical motions, she removed the remainder of her attire and placed the components tidily in an unorganized heap on a random location on the floor. Subsequently, she collapsed onto the bed and instructed the illumination to extinguish. In this state of sensory deprivation, her thoughts resonated with exceptional clarity. Remaining motionless for a few moments only highlighted how her mind appeared incapable of quieting, even in this fatigued condition. Amidst the myriad of minor musings swirling about, the most pressing inquiry persistently blazed before her closed eyes. How could she lie here resting, while there was an intelligent alien presence close by, that she could inquire literally any query from? An alien with a stunningly distinct culture and society, whose knowledge it literally embodied in its entirety. And Neil had scarcely even grazed the surface. Nevertheless, without adequate sleep, she wouldn't be capable of formulating coherent inquiries in any case. Groping blindly, she grasped the headboard and located a detachable screen, which she removed and held before her. It flickered on, emitting a faint glow, and presented her with an array of options to select from. "Open up the latest recording I brought." It complied. "Jump to the timestamp where I had asked to hear a lullaby and play." Once more it obliged, and Neil lent an ear to her own voice ere the initial notes of Naya's composition commenced a handful of instants thereafter. "Save this timestamp and stop playing when I'm asleep." Returning the screen to its position, she rolled onto her side. On this occasion, she didn't stay conscious long enough to catch the pings from the mid-range merging. Disregarding her need for rest was likely unwise, yet Niar found herself unable to dismiss Kayla's disclosure that the human mind comprised distinct components that somehow collaborated to generate intelligence. How could such a phenomenon evolve in phases? What manner of species endured with an incomplete manifestation of it? The reptile, did it truly lack two kinds of the human mind, rather than merely possessing a tinier variation? It still seemed unfathomable to her, and she endeavored to uncover a rationale for why evolution would not simply prompt brain size and, in parallel, the cognitive capability to expand. She pondered over how the process of natural selection could most efficiently shape a functional mind. After exploring several design iterations, she chanced upon a notion that disrupted her thought process with a profound realization. The human brain must possess a split architecture, for its functionality was divided across those distinct components. A basic life form could endure with minimal mental capacity, as there was little need for complex bodily regulation. It could only grow more intricate if the brain expanded, or a novel organ emerged to handle these additional processes. Rather than gradually enlarging, new functions would simply be assumed by further additions. allowing biology to retain the most efficient iterations that had proven successful before. If humans were born underdeveloped and, as Carla had asserted, devoid of knowledge, how were their bodies capable of functioning correctly? There must have been an organ accountable for it, something they seemingly had no direct command over. And it had to be one of these layers. As a result, it did imply that humans were indeed able to instruct their reliant offspring. The initial lesson Naya acquired from her ancestor, and the primary instruction she imparted to her offspring, was the mastery of the body's other organs. It was a process so deeply ingrained that she barely registered it, despite a minuscule portion of her consciousness being perpetually devoted to it. But what if an independent organ assumed that responsibility? Would she still perceive it as an extension of her brain if it were not physically integrated within it? The mental strain of this contemplative process had once more been substantial, and she needed to be cautious not to overexert herself. However, just before she could ultimately release and halt those racing contemplations, a second profound realization struck her. That common functionality also accounted for the human's evident intelligence and remarkable technological prowess, in spite of their diminutive stature. They had augmented their own cognition by codifying knowledge into notions that could be externalized. They had actually created another layer onto their biological brain. The illumination from the airlock spilled into the corridor, casting Neil's silhouette as an extended shadow upon the sleek, light grey flooring. She arrived a touch ahead of schedule as she took the final few paces toward the conference chamber. The flat partition remained simply a barrier at that moment. During their lengthiest pause, nothing appeared to have visibly transformed. The white cube, reaching waist-high, remained situated beside the armchair, supporting the translator and the mechanical timepiece that emanated a soft radiance from the scant illumination that graced it. Purely for the sake of thoroughness, she corroborated that the gilded plaque, the vase, and the painting were likewise still present. She did introduce a fresh addition to the assortment, an item she had meticulously arranged to be printed as near to the authentic as feasible, for despite the reality that solely the genuine article would suffice in this circumstance, there was not a solitary sheet of paper aboard the entire vessel. They had been so adamant about equipping the exploration craft with as much storage capacity and backup systems as possible, there was no room for books or any writing surfaces. This signified that the white sheet, marked with 24 lines of jet-black text, was actually composed entirely of synthetic materials. Its constituents had not been derived from wood and then assembled through a top-down approach, but were instead extruded from the nozzles of a matter printer, which had created this sheet from the molecular level in a bottom-up fashion. It was likely the most inefficient method conceivable to transcribe a couple sentences onto a piece of paper, and had undoubtedly constituted a massive squandering of printing time. A couple of minutes later, as the lighting in the room came on and the barrier turned transparent, Neil cheerfully called out, "Good morning, Naya. I had a really restful sleep and I hope you feel refreshed and energized as well. I'm delighted by your return and equally pleased that you've had a restful time. I've replenished my energy reserves and readied myself to reliably assist in this quest to gain deeper insight into your captivating species." Once more under the scrutiny of those dark eyes, the sensation had gradually shifted from unsettling to familiar, and at present it even felt mildly agreeable. Neil grinned widely, for it appeared Naya was equally prepared to depart following a satisfying breakfast and a cup of coffee. "This is what I've brought for you," she spoke, lifting the sheet of synthetic paper that idly swayed with her motion, to address some queries from the previous day, and additionally exhibit something I had referenced earlier but couldn't illustrate at the time. Could this item be yet another repository of information? Naya's translator conveyed his remarkably precise inference. It is, in fact, one of the most ancient forms of preserved knowledge. This is the written word, spoken utterances, transcribed into symbols that can be interpreted by virtually any human being. It is a universal code, founded upon 26 distinct symbols we term letters. With just those symbols, we can compactly encode knowledge and data simply on marked surfaces, like this sheet. There are 10 additional symbols, referred to as numerals, used to denote natural numeric quantities. While elucidating her point, she gestured towards the initial line on the document, which displayed the alphabet and numerals from 0 to 9. Despite no overt cues, Neil sensed that Nayar's gaze was fixated on the paper, and this colossal entity would undoubtedly have no difficulty discerning the diminutive symbols inscribed upon the square, which likely bore a relative magnitude no larger than a postage stamp viewed from a distance of 10 meters. Neil continued explaining, "These sheets can bear text or illustrations on both the front and back sides, with additional sheets accommodating more content as required. A number of those can be collated into a stack and bound together along one long edge to form a codex that can be perused by turning the pages." For a significant portion of our history, this was the optimal method we possessed to reliably preserve all manner of information, such as, for instance, scientific knowledge, historical occurrences, or fictional narratives. "Can you read the knowledge stored on this paper?" Kyla's utterances held little significance, as Nayar couldn't fully comprehend them anyhow. Her focus was primarily drawn to the motion of Kyla's eyes gliding across the paper, presumably tracing those lines of written text. The meaning seemed to be effortlessly deciphered by Kyla as she spoke at a natural pace, supplementing their previous discussion with additional elucidations. This, then, was the true potency of language. Ideas first abstracted into words and then into those symbols to place them onto a medium so slender that it could be layered and amassed into vast repositories of knowledge. These could subsequently likely be effortlessly replicated to serve as storage and means of communication simultaneously. What an ingenious method to make up for a memory that couldn't be imparted directly and was bound to a being destined to perish. It had likely brought about a substantial transformation in their society when this means of preserving their language was discovered, perhaps necessitating a massive evolutionary change where only those with the capacity to utilize it endured. Nayar was already aware that the direct conversion of their language into electromagnetic waves was likely what transpired next, for that had been the method by which she was granted the compendium of their language, making it straightforward for her to learn to converse in it. She pondered momentarily what might have occurred if she had instead been merely furnished with those symbols. "I had not encountered this storage system or encoded language when I received the initial briefing. Did humanity create technology that superseded it?" Carla responded negatively, informing her that written language remained in daily use by almost all humans, with machines now employed to display and store text rather than paper. Simultaneously, these devices could seemingly store immense quantities of information efficiently. Even though Carla seemed to simplify her explanation, or so she asserted, large portions remained indecipherable technical jargon for Nayar. Perhaps that explained her misunderstanding, for if humans possessed the capability to store and retrieve factual knowledge through machines, why hadn't Carla simply done so? Or could it be that during the recess she had accessed those responses that lingered unresolved from the prior gathering? Nayar composed a concise inquiry. "What was the reason you did not bring such a device?" She responded that due to human technology being heavily tailored only for themselves, it would be nearly impossible for any non-human entity to properly operate these machines and then successfully navigate the stored data. Furthermore, Carla mentioned something called the First Contact Protocol that had been established during the early days of human space exploration and outlined clear guidelines on how to conduct oneself when encountering another sentient species for the first time. One crucial guideline seemingly prohibited the use of any apparatus or contraption that would transmit signals via any channel on frequencies or intensities beyond tightly specified secure ranges. The fundamental rationale had been the naturally generated sounds of plants, animals, and the environment of Earth, plainly excluding anything related to humans, of course. Carla clarified that the gear she utilized and the objects she had carried were completely emission-free, and even her spacecraft had only single-line pinpoint quantum entanglement communication without any broadcasting abilities. She then further noted that for the same reason, she had kept her body entirely devoid of device integration. For one, it rendered the full-spectrum communication blockage field generator that Niar had constructed entirely purposeless. For another, it raised a multitude of queries regarding the final portion of Carla's statement. Niar must have misinterpreted, because if she hadn't, it would suggest that humans had integrated their biology with machines. Could you kindly elaborate on the context behind your remark regarding the absence of machines integrated with your biological systems? A steady unease seemed to underlie Kyla's rather cautious explanation. From it, Niar had received confirmation that humans did indeed incorporate non-biological additions onto their own bodies. Carla elucidated that the initial forms were mechanical replacements for limbs and organs. However, the technology progressed to a point where most humans augmented their brains with specialized devices. Niar had to swiftly halt herself from envisioning how this would purportedly function, as it appeared excessively grisly. She forwarded the straightforward query to the translator. What compels humans to act in this manner? Connectivity, Neil responded. She expanded on that thought a moment later. Much of our technological progress stemmed from the wish to remain linked with others. Across our inhabited regions, there exists a vast communication network that nearly everyone desires constant access to. I suppose implanting the requisite devices directly into the head is merely the natural progression after developing those devices to a point where they could be perpetually carried with us. The translator swiftly responded with an inquiry. I fail to comprehend how inflicting harm upon the brain could possibly yield any advantageous outcome. It seemed Niar had a grave misapprehension regarding bionic implants, and the blame lay squarely on Neil's shoulders. How could she anticipate an extraterrestrial who had never utilized electronic computers to grasp her casual reference to them being integrated with brains? Neil rested against the back of the chair, folding her arms across her chest. She felt she had perhaps delved too deeply into the particulars, wondering how much further elaboration would prove coherent. All right, I understand that my explanation was inadequate. Allow me to clarify first that cranial implants do not cause any harm to the brain whatsoever. They are, in fact, extremely small and rest on the outer surface of it. Furthermore, they merely transmit faint electrical signals to influence it. Instinctively gesturing toward her head, as though that might clarify things, she remarked, "The brain itself undergoes no physical alteration, and the procedures for implantation or removal are quite straightforward." There was a lull before Niar adjusted slightly, and then another minute elapsed before the translator spoke. "I understand that employing machines to surpass biological constraints is your approach, but I cannot fathom transcending mere utilization for full integration. I wish to inquire as to why you have eschewed these implants if communication is held in such high esteem." Neil rose to his feet and replied, "My aim was to remain prepared to serve as an ambassador for initial contact." The wave of sincerity that Carla radiated was as potent as when she had successfully persuaded Niar not to prematurely terminate the meeting. It was peculiar. Carla had voiced the human's aspiration to discover other sapient species to forge friendships with them, and they had seemingly prepared for this scenario since their initial departure from their solar system. And now, even Carla herself had exhibited an extraordinary enthusiasm to be the one to initiate first contact. What was the driving force behind their eagerness to discover intelligent beings beyond their home world? Niar's space explorations had been solely focused on locating inhabited planets and documenting those celestial bodies, as well as the stars encountered along the way. The preparations she had undertaken for potential first contact scenarios had only occurred subsequent to receiving those initial transmissions from the humans. Once more, Niar asked a straightforward query. "What is the reason behind your wish to discover intelligent life forms?" Oddly, what emanated from Carla was a profound feeling of solitude so powerful that Niar could recall just one instance that vaguely resembled it. The moment when the primordial one had realized her divergence from her forebears, finding herself incapable of truly connecting with any other entity. Carla brought her back from that recollection, as she noted how humans had always yearned to discover that they weren't the sole sapient species in the past. She elucidated that, in fictional works, these encounters with beings from outer space were merely a small facet of a highly prevalent theme that encompassed a substantial portion of storytelling in general, where other sapient entities coexisted alongside humans. This yearning had likewise been ingrained in Carla, and she proceeded to recount her childhood days, recalling how, amidst the boundless expanse of the night sky, she envisioned the prospect of life nestled within those near countless other realms, revolving around distant stars, hoping that somewhere existence would blossom into a form not merely intelligent, but also capable and willing to engage in communication. The preceding years of space exploration had proven quite disheartening, as the only living beings encountered were as far removed from intelligence as possible. This had merely strengthened their resolve to find someone with whom to converse. Carla concluded by stating that humans had simply felt a sense of solitude. How peculiar to discover an entire species that echoed the emotions of a single being. It appeared the humans had experienced what the first one had felt during her solitude. Had Nayar's kind transcended this sensation in some manner? She could not discern this yearning within herself or in any other recollections. Yet swiftly she dismissed that notion, focusing instead on a crucial inquiry that had surfaced previously during their discourse on written language. At what juncture had humankind acquired the capacity to preserve language, and by extension historical accounts? This intrigues me, and although I do not share a comparable yearning intrinsic to my kind, I can comprehend the sentiment. I wish to expand my understanding of your species' past, so please enlighten me on how long this paper-based knowledge repository system has been utilized by your kind. Carla found herself oscillating between various emotional states as she responded, admitting her lack of precise knowledge regarding the year, and offering a conjecture that it was likely around 5 millennia in the past. Upon some quick mental arithmetic, Nayar could put that time span into perspective, and was actually somewhat taken aback by its considerable duration. Given how Carla had lamented her scant knowledge of ancient humans, this period would encompass a substantial portion of their species' chronicle and the existences of billions upon billions of individuals. This experience greatly stirred her yearning to absorb knowledge from this abundance of insights. I wish to obtain records of the documented language detailing the factual occurrences that transpired over the course of those 5 millennia, in order to gain insight into the historical narrative of your civilization. Neil was somewhat taken aback, yet it was truly the utter absence of her astonishment regarding Nayar's recent request that gave him pause. Though it was probable that she did greatly overvalue the significance and extent of insight to be gleaned from the annals of human history. Without restraining her gestures, she elucidated, "I'm able to furnish you with historical accounts in context. However, those primordial writings themselves may not prove overly beneficial for gaining a clear perspective of the past. At best, they offer a fragmented recollection, and at worst, outright falsehoods. I did bring up the printing press, which emerged around 200 years after your time, an innovation that transformed our world by allowing the mass duplication of the written word. From that point onward, records became plentiful, and we possess more knowledge about the 8 centuries following the printing press than we do about all the millennia preceding it." Nayar swiftly interjected, not allowing her a chance to expound further with the inquiry, "Kindly expand upon the historical chronology, as I seem to have misapprehended the developmental narrative of your species. For how long has the human race been in existence, and when did your utilization of machinery commence?" Did the translator sound impatient, or had that been a fluke? While it remains impossible to clearly distinguish the latest pre-humans from the earliest humans, the transition had occurred around 200,000 years ago. The period leading up to the first written records is termed prehistory, a time where we could only reconstruct the evolution of our ancestors through the significant impacts they had on the world and the artifacts that could endure countless seasons, to then be discovered, documented, and contextualized by historians. What we term the modern era, The epoch of intricate machinery commenced almost 6 centuries past and was succeeded by the Space Age, which we dub the present times, though in my personal view, we have progressed into the Stellar Age by now. In any case, the Space Age began when the first humans journeyed to another celestial body 2.5 centuries ago. An extended quietude ensued, so prolonged in fact that Neil grew mildly apprehensive. It was further compounded by Niar's motionless state and her unwavering spotlight-like stare, which began to unsettle him. Carefully she asked, "Is everything okay?" So humans were concurrently more ancient and more recent than Niar's species. The first of those countless beings emerged 200,000 years ago. They truly comprehended events for merely 5 of those millennia, then commenced developing technology just within the past 1,000 years, and at that pinnacle somehow progressed from their initial machines to interplanetary spacecraft in under 4 centuries. How could that have been feasible? It had required Niar's race almost 200 years to fully comprehend the mathematical principles governing atmospheric flight. Achieving the capability to depart their homeworld had demanded a span 10 times longer, not even accounting for grasping the intricate physical conditions of the deep cosmic expanse. Just as she was starting to somewhat comprehend and even relate to humans, Carla had divulged this scarcely believable information. How could their civilization even function during periods of such incredibly swift transformations? Was this feasible because they routinely swapped out individuals due to age-related mortality, making adaptation more straightforward? Evolutionary shifts could not account for it, as those would necessitate substantially more time than the mere few centuries that encompassed their entire history. Considering their immense population size and this timeline, it was utterly inconceivable for Niar to envision their world at any point in the past. She had presumed that humans must have roughly followed a comparable developmental trajectory as her species, likely hindered by their restricted lifespans and inefficient method of disseminating knowledge. She had pictured them gradually unfolding their potential over tens of thousands of years, instead of essentially bursting into their space age within mere centuries of discovering an effective way to overcome one of those limitations. If the earliest members of their race could have preserved all their wisdom and constructed as skillfully as Niar was capable of, what might they have achieved over those 200,000 years? Or simply considering the present condition of humanity, how vastly different might they become in a single century's time? Her thoughts spun with the myriad of possibilities that unveiled themselves. Snapping back to the moment, she realized that, yet again, she had become unresponsive in front of Carla. Trying to account for her behavior, she strung together a couple of words and fed them into the translator. The initial member of our kind gained independence 7,342 years prior, marking the total age of our species. It took us a span of 5 millennia to depart from our world of origin. Neil exerted her utmost effort to grasp that staggering number. More than 7 millennia. The first one predated the entirety of human civilization. The wisdom she must have amassed over that vast expanse of time had to be immeasurable. The recollections of hundreds of thousands, nay, millions of days etched into that flawless memory. That alone was already beyond comprehension. Yet Niar had carried all of that history, along with her own millennium of recollections. And then there were even more individuals of her kind, at the very least, tens of thousands more. How many were older than Niar herself? Neil's thoughts raced as the true implications of immortality in this context only now truly dawned on him. Merely attempting to grasp the vast expanse of knowledge Niar's mind contained, she reached the boundaries of her imagination and felt she had caught a fleeting glimpse of what could truly be described as eternity. If every single member of her species also possessed all that wisdom, well, she found only the immense breadth of the internet to be comparable in sheer magnitude. Over the course of their history, humans had painstakingly amassed a vast trove of information, and in the past 2 centuries, their efforts were largely focused on making this knowledge accessible and usable for every individual. Yet there stood Niar, a singular entity whose capabilities rivaled all that collective human endeavor. Neil sank wearily into the chair, the sheer volume of unanswered queries swirling through her mind, leaving her utterly drained. Even a lifetime would scarcely be enough to quench her insatiable thirst for knowledge. Naya, words fail me when attempting to grasp the concept of existing for over 7 millennia. I trust you concur that juxtaposing our histories and timelines holds little merit. Raising her hands, she ran her fingers through her curly locks as she went on. I realize now that grasping more than a small portion of the first one's existence is unattainable for me, but I would still appreciate learning whether she was reunited with her child. If you don't mind, I'd be grateful if you could continue the tale. Behind the barrier, Naya lowered her head to be at eye height to Neil. The booming voice of the translator spoke. I will gladly tell you. The first one had spent 2 cycles in a perpetual state of motion, her goal being to locate fast breeder nests and her progeny. And during the storm periods, she had forgone hibernation, instead focusing her mind on extracting knowledge from her memories and observations. She discovered methods to bring order to her mind, which were the early forms of meditation, and proceeded to solve the scientific conundrums that lay before her. It was her initial foray into the discovery of the fundamental laws of the mathematical cosmos. The wakefulness, however, came at a substantial energy cost, leaving her with an intense hunger after the storms. This had significantly impacted her biology and caused her body to forego the creation of another offspring during the 7th time of abundance. Nevertheless, it had also granted her an unprecedented comprehension of the world, and she had refined her armor and combat technique to such an extent that she had become nearly impervious to the fast breeder attacks. In the subsequent cycle's cooling phase, she was reunited with her young as she engaged a hunting party of predators. It came as an unexpected yet profoundly joyous moment when her offspring rallied to her aid. Astonishing as well had been the transformation in her progeny, as she now exhibited not merely a sharp rise in intellect, but also conveyed that she had allied herself with the first one's mission during the period of isolation, to curb the rapid reproducers and safeguard the ancestral species. It was only subsequent to the time spent alone that she emerged as the second member of my kind. Naya paused, and Neil momentarily thought she had finished the tale and was preparing to comment, when the translator interrupted her. The period following their reuniting is not one I can discuss casually. The first permitted herself to bear more young, and likewise did the second. Of the 5 young ones gaining autonomy over the next 6 seasons, merely 3 emerged from their solitary youth. The initial one comprehended that for the continuance of our kind, the swiftly multiplying predators must be utterly eliminated, as the woodlands dwindled in the relentless encroachment of the arid lands. Have they eliminated all rapid breeding species? Neil found herself unable to refrain from interposing. A moment elapsed prior to the response arriving, apparently transforming the resounding voice of the translator into a muted echo of its former self. Indeed. Yet Naya swiftly resumed, as though the interruption hadn't occurred. When the final predators roaming the woods were hunted to extinction, my kind had grasped the principles governing atmospheric flight sufficiently to construct gliding winged vessels. Utilizing them, they traversed the desert expanse in search of the forest they presumed lay on the other side. While they discovered bountiful lands, they observed them to be bereft of my ancestral kind, as the predators had eliminated all of them. My species continued the crusade of eradication there until there were genuinely no rapid reproducers remaining on the primordial world. The population had grown to 756 souls, a figure that would persist for the next 2,000 years as our kind focused on preserving what little remained. It was then that you termed the era that followed the space age. Was it another pause or just silence? Neil sensed the gravity of this tale and the implications it carried. Naya's detached narration proved a blessing, sparing Neil the turmoil these recollections must stir. "I'm so sorry," she said quietly. This response was unanticipated. The feelings radiating from Kyla were wholly compassionate, and she exuded such strongly soothing and comforting vibes that their warmth unexpectedly dispelled the fear, anguish, and profoundly ingrained sense of shame that had accompanied these recollections. "I don't understand." Nayar unwittingly put her confusion into words. Carla commenced explaining, with an unchanging demeanor, that she encountered difficulties properly relating to these occurrences, despite the fact that she evidently did not. She proceeded to discourse about the humans' past, when they had been prey to other creatures, and as a vestige of that era, still harbored a fear of the darkness. And of different eras when the human species as a whole had such an uncertain future before them that multiple generations were afflicted by the anxiety. While she emphasized the significant difference between this developed apprehension and the indirect understanding from historical accounts, as well as the sentiments Nayar's kind experienced by essentially living through those recollections. She reiterated her inability to relate to living with such vivid ancestral memories that still held profound impact after 7 millennia. This was the reason behind her expressed sympathy, as she recognized that every individual of Nayar's species had to overcome their entire historical legacy upon reaching maturity and synchronizing their collective knowledge, as if they had personally experienced it. Nayar was profoundly struck by this insight. She had perceived Kayla's empathy previously, but to witness this human, a diminutive creature with a finite existence and a history obscured by faded recollections, grasp Nayar's species in such a manner was truly remarkable. At that moment, she sensed she could entrust the world's faith to Carla's care, yet she had to prevent her mind from wandering into such musings. After all, this was a diplomatic gathering between two entire species, one proving far more fruitful than she could have ever envisioned upon receiving those initial transmissions. "Thank you, Carla. I realize that our gathering must shortly draw to a close, as I need to make my way back to the Source realm." Concern and astonishment intermingled with Carla's query as to whether she had uttered or acted improperly. "Since our initial encounter, you have not erred even once. My sole intention is to impart the knowledge I have acquired, so that a genuine bond of friendship may be forged between our species. Never before have I been privy to information as precious and vital as this, hence my eagerness to hasten my return. However, should you harbor any further pressing inquiries, I shall gladly tarry to address them." Myriad queries arose in her thoughts simultaneously, each appearing more pressing than the previous one, and maintaining clarity was already challenging enough without the added strain of Nayar's apparent eagerness to depart, which she found difficult to dispel as an ominous indication despite the reassurances. Somehow she managed to prioritize and first inquired, "Would you be so kind as to tell me where your world of origin lies, so that we may avoid trespassing into your domain inadvertently?" "There wouldn't be any problem with human vessels journeying to the home planet. My kind would receive you hospitably, even lacking the insights I've acquired. However, I cannot disclose to you the location as I'm incapable of conveying my method of navigation through speech." "How distant is it then?" Neil inquired, swiftly appending. "We quantify stellar distances in light years. That refers to the expanse of space traversed by light in a vacuum during the course of one terrestrial year, which in this instance spans 365.25 days. She perceived Nayar's stare wandering, and rotated her head to observe that those dark eyes were likely focused on the mechanical timepiece. A prolonged silence ensued, making it evident to Neil that some computations were transpiring. "The span to the realm of inception from this location measures 10,012.5 light-years. The interpreter broke the stillness. When the figure 10 emerged, she felt astonished. After the term 1,000 ensued, she was profoundly stunned. The energy requisite to traverse that expanse would likely be inconceivably immense. Should Neil employ her vessel, the power demands would probably rival those of entire countries. There existed no trepidation that humans could stumble upon that domain. It was utterly unfeasible. I believe I might not have elucidated it properly. You see, Earth lies a bit more than 200 light-years distant, and I required a catapult to arrive here swiftly enough. To return, I'd likely need to partition the voyage into around 20 segments, and it'll take me approximately a month. And merely to confirm her supposition, she posed the inquiry. Are you aware of the proximity to the nearest celestial body from this location, and the duration it would require for you to traverse that distance? It stands at a distance of 4.2 light-years, but lacking knowledge of the route, I can merely surmise that the journey would take less than a day given the distance. However, it's crucial to grasp that in space travel, distance holds little relevance as the chosen path alone determines the duration of the voyage. Neil buried her fingers into her tousled curls, gently kneading her scalp. The distance matched what she had recalled from the charts when looking up the rendezvous coordinates. It seemed Niar possessed the capacity for remarkably swift travel as well. However, she would leave those inquiries to the astrophysicists and instead posed a different query. Would you care to explain why you cannot convey information about this gathering to others of your kind, rather than returning? Our kind lacks the innate capacity to impart knowledge across such an immense expanse, and the informational richness diminishes significantly when converting it into other energy forms for transmission. Distorting this knowledge and thereby stripping it of its complete context would be unbecoming of its profound significance. From her response, a single query emerged, which she promptly voiced. Is your kind unaware of this gathering? When the initial messages arrived, I was accompanied, and the other person has carried that awareness back to their realm of origin. All right, I see, Neil responded as she pondered how to frame her next inquiry. What's the designation for your kind? You've referred to my species multiple times, but do you have a collective name like the one you have for yourself? Nya rotated her large head and adjusted her substantial frame prior to responding via the translator. Our kind does not possess a designated name. Should you require a name for my species in order to identify us to other humans, you may now choose one as this language system originates from your people. Was she correct in her understanding that she was meant to provide a name for Niar's kind? She found it challenging to maintain an even tone when seeking clarification. You desire me to name your species? Indeed, the translator responded as behind the transparent partition, Niar's head bobbed in affirmation. She now felt quite put on the spot. Their official designations were numerical, derived from the systems where their initial signals had been detected, as stated in the documents. For a brief moment, she contemplated whether inventing a new term might be advisable, but then recalled that such a step was unnecessary. What are your thoughts on Initari? It's the designation of an imaginary species of beings that were engaged in the endeavor of chronicling the entirety of the galaxy. They manifest in a brief narrative where they encounter humans and are completely perplexed by them, as our kind proves too erratic and unforeseen to suitably classify. They bring you to mind as they too possess a tremendous breadth of shared knowledge and an enthusiasm for learning, ever journeying across the cosmos. Moreover, their manner of operating machinery through telekinesis bears resemblance to your own. Though smaller in stature than humans, they are grey in hue, and perhaps even immortal. Kyla's feelings tied to the word she had picked were agreeable and cozy, rendering it instantly evident that it was certainly an apt selection. Despite that, there lingered a hint of awkwardness that accompanied her utterance. This is an excellent choice, then, and I appreciate you selecting the word so thoughtfully. I'd be interested to understand the origin of your discomfort regarding the imaginary species you've portrayed. With a flustered demeanor, it took Kyla a moment to clarify that she had authored that particular story herself, and she was uncertain whether employing a word she had coined was appropriate. This experience has not altered my perspective, and I am content with being recognized as one of your creations. Kindly inform me if there is any additional information you require prior to my departure. A hint of unease lingered, as Kyla responded that while she had numerous inquiries, she did not wish to prolong the delay any further. However, she did inquire about Niar's intentions once the gathering had concluded. I shall modify my vessel to follow the ideal trajectory that will guide me back to the realm of origin, where I shall arrive in 25 days' time. Upon reaching there, I will journey to interface with as many as feasible in order to disseminate the recollections of this encounter. You should anticipate more beings like myself arriving at this place in 25 days' time, seeking additional encounters to better comprehend humans. I hope you will also be present again, as you are the only human individual my kind is acquainted with. Carla conveyed that she would ensure the meeting place would not be vacant, and that the humans were as keen to sustain relations as the Inatari. It was evident that she was suppressing further inquiries. So this is it then for now. As the translator spoke, there seemed a hint of wistfulness in its voice, though perhaps that was merely Neil's imagination playing tricks once more. I have gained knowledge beyond what I had anticipated, and I am truly impressed by the accomplishments of humanity. Please accept my deepest gratitude for your patience in the face of my errors and for the gifts you have brought for my kind. Thank you, though it was your efforts that enabled our communication. I'm truly delighted we could lay the foundation for relations between our peoples. Please also accept my gratitude for hosting me aboard your marvelous vessel. While conversing, she had approached the barrier until her visage was nearly grazing it. Only from such proximity could she fully perceive Niar, a sight her eyes had yet to acclimate to. Instinctively she pressed her palm against the transparent surface, as though that gesture might allow her to sense the reality her vision absorbed. The apprehension she felt initially appeared to resurface as she continued. If I may add a personal remark, I find you truly remarkable, Niar, and I cannot adequately convey how captivating the Inatorian capabilities are that you've demonstrated to me. Niar advanced against the barrier too, rendering her considerable form highly conspicuous. Unexpectedly, she then raised one of her 4 smaller limbs and stretched it forth to delicately graze the spot where Neil had her hand positioned, utilizing a solitary digit that tapered smoothly to a point twice the size of her palm. For an instant she paused her breathing, had Niar not merely perceived, but also comprehended her aim. That would prove rather awkward for Neil once more, but swiftly she dismissed those musings and seized this chance to observe Niar, as she was nearer than she'd ever been previously. The contrast between that lone hand and Neil was remarkable. She could easily envision herself being scooped up by it, as the palm likely had sufficient space for her to sit. From this proximity, she could also discern that the grey skin wasn't entirely featureless. There were several rings and lines where the surface texture seemed to differ. Neil contemplated that those areas would likely extend or contract to facilitate movement. It was quite inhuman in other aspects too, with the 3 fingers being of equal length and the hand appearing symmetrical. Moreover, it wasn't evident whether there were bones within, as the 2 retracted digits curled in seamlessly. Slowly Neil stepped back. Will I see you again? I shall come back after every single person on the home planet has learned of your name, Calantha Daniela Neil. Neil remained seated in the communication chamber of her vessel, unmoving. The larger and quite frankly far more imposing craft of Niar had departed without a trace long ago, and Neil had just concluded her exchange with her contact. Part of her thoughts lingered on the remarkable events of the past couple of days, while the other part grappled with the fresh details she had acquired through the call. She was tasked with spearheading a newly formed cross-species knowledge-sharing program, supervising all forthcoming interactions and even mentoring envoys and researchers. In merely 50 more days, the Inatori would be arriving, yet she remained uncertain about their numbers. The sole thing she was aware of, a significant quantity of human spacecraft, were also headed in her direction. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel. And for every comment that comments 77, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.